How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a fresh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Hit it. Oh, I hit it. We're recording now. Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, which is the podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. I am one of your hosts, Gary Horn.
And I am co-host Justin Bishop. It sounded like you were about to give yourself a further title. The way
I thought I was going to have more to give there, but I didn't. Turns out I'm just I'm always waiting in anticipation for what I'll say next too.
And I'm writer comedian Mr. Todd A. Davis. When you stare into the podcast stares into you through your ears.
Oh, stares into your ears. Your
Thank
ear holes?
you for into your ear holes. Thank you for joining us for our deep dive on another film in our series on Mr. James Cameron, The Man of Tomorrow.
Wow.
I hate that I laughed at that stupid deep dive.
I did too. We all laughed at it. I hate it. Oh man,
that's the kind of magic. That's the kind of magic I bring to the show, fellas.
Thank you, Todd. That's why you're writer comedian, Todd.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where that comes from. You don't just get the title of writer comedian for nothing.
Yeah, available for parties, bar mitzvahs, corporate events.
Have you done a bar mitzvah yet?
I'm dying to do a bar mitzvah. That would be so much fun.
So when he was a kid growing up in Chippewa, James Cameron lived only about a half a mile upstream from Niagara Falls. And while he was hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean at the time, and he wouldn't actually put so much as a toe into the ocean until he was a teenager when his family moved to California. But the roar of the water, this is something that people always say about Chippewa. The roar of the water is kind of constantly in the background because they're so close to that massive waterfall that you just hear it all the time. It's like it's like background music. And you know, water and its mysteries proved to be a fascination for the aspiring filmmaker. And you may remember that, you know, as a kid, James Cameron was a nerd. He was a nerd. We could just say it. He was a nerd. He was a science nerd. You know, he was very talented in a lot of ways, even as a kid, but he was very good in the sciences. And because he received such high grades in science while he was in school, Cameron was invited to attend a series of lectures just over the U.S. border at a university in Buffalo, New York. And one of those lectures was given by a diver who showed a film of an experiment where he had breathed liquid oxygen. One of his goals was actually send humans deeper into the oceans. By breathing liquid rather than air, the diver's body could more easily withstand the changes in pressure. That research didn't get very far. You got to think this is the 1960s at the time. This is a while back, and it didn't get very far because the diver, they couldn't quite nail down the right mix of gases. But the idea behind it ignited the 16-year-old James Cameron's imagination. And so the next day, he starts writing a short story about an underwater science lab perched on the edge of the Cayman Trough, which is the deepest point in the Caribbean. And in this short story that he wrote, these scientists were testing experimental fluid breathing gear, and they made dives down the wall of the trough, going deeper and deeper, but none of them would come back. They would just fail to return every time until finally there's like one diver left, and he follows them. You know, he goes through kind of a should I or should I not, but he decides he's going to follow them and see what happened. And he does, and he experiences a kind of rapture, ending up in a depth-induced psychosis. This is pretty like heady stuff for a 16-year-old to be writing.
Yeah,
I was just like, I was listening to Limp Bizkit and drawing like pictures of Ren and Stimpy in school, you know, and like this, James Cameron, he's probably a lot smarter than any of us.
I was in high school replacing my own oxygen with other liquid, but it was alcohol.
I had my fingers crossed, desperately hoping to make it out of high school.
Yeah, that was really what I was doing. I was a nerd.
Yeah. So over the years, this story would change a little bit, but the bones of that short story, written again by a 16-year-old kid, fueled by his love of science fiction and his fascination with the water, would eventually become the screenplay for James Cameron's most grueling and personal film, the subject of today's episode, which is, of course, The Abyss.
It began 2 years ago in an unfinished nuclear power plant. It became one of the most challenging motion pictures ever made. And on August 9th, the most original adventure of the summer will begin at theaters everywhere. From James Cameron, the writer and director of The Terminator and Aliens, comes The Abyss.
God, I hate that bitch.
Probably shouldn't have married her then, huh?
Hang on, gentlemen.
Here's a bottomless pit, baby. 2.5 miles straight down.
It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I don't think they mean us any harm. I don't know how I know that.
Whatever happens, it's up to us. That guy scares me more than anything that's down there.
But we all see what we want to see. Coffee looks and he sees hate and fear. You have to look with better eyes than that.
Was that the sound of the abyss? What was that?
That's the sound of the abyss makes. It's cracking open a beer or a monster.
When you crack open the abyss cracks open into you.
That's
Yeah.
it opens its crack for you. I don't know.
I don't like that. Real quick, before we get into the rest of the episode, this is something that we never really do, but we figured maybe this is your first time listening to Cinema Shock, in which case, thanks, welcome. But we do take deep dives into these films, and to do so, we can't skirt around story points. So we're going to do this with the assumption that you've watched the movie, and we do encourage you to watch the movie along with us, because otherwise we're going to spoil the shit out of it for you. That's just there's really no way around it as detailed as we get on the production side of things here.
They get wet.
What?
See, there you go. That was the spoiler.
Yeah, that is nice. A spoiler. So James Cameron, a little bit of this is going to be some background information. So if you've listened to the last couple episodes of this series, you may have heard a little bit of this, but James Cameron and Gail Ann Hurd, his producer, they had gotten married just before Aliens went into production, but because of the filming schedule, they didn't have the chance to go on a proper honeymoon until after that movie came out. So after Aliens was released, the couple headed to the south of France, but when they got there were so many like European tourists there. When they arrived, that they changed their plans and flew out to the Cayman Islands. Must be nice to just like land in Europe and go, nah, let's just go to the Cayman Islands. Forget this. That Aliens money is doing them well, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So they went to the Cayman Islands, where they chartered a boat and spent their honeymoon scuba diving and exploring. And this is all happening just miles from where Cameron had set that short story that he'd written as a teenager. It's in that same area. So when they returned from their honeymoon, Cameron's kind of deciding what he wants to do next. He's in a kind of a sweet spot where he can kind of work on whatever he wants. Kind of same thing happened after The Terminator, but even more so after Aliens, because it was such a big hit. So he starts kind of brainstorming ideas, trying to decide what his follow-up's going to be. And at the same time, Hurd, she actually signed on to produce her first non-Cameron movie since her days working with Roger Corman. It ended up being a thriller starring James Caan and Mandy Patinkin called Alien Nation. You guys remember Alien Nation?
I do vaguely remember their
I
heads.
mostly remember the TV show that
Yeah.
came after than the original movie, but I don't remember much about it. I remember it's kind of a buddy cop movie. Only one of the cops happens to be an alien,
Yeah.
something like that. You know, I think that it's like that. What was that Will Smith movie with orcs that came out on Netflix a few years ago? Bright.
Oh, Bright.
It
Yeah.
sounds
yeah,
like
yeah.
the same story as Bright, but with aliens.
Yeah, kind of.
So it was Hurd who actually urged Cameron to work on turning his short story into a screenplay. So Cameron started reworking the idea into a viable treatment for a film. And while the resulting script would be a lot more ambitious than the story he'd written in high school, he made a lot of changes to it. But one of the kind of biggest changes that he made to it was to have his cast of characters, not scientists, but blue collar workers. His reasoning was that he thought that blue collar workers would just be more commercially viable than scientists.
It's more relatable.
Yeah, they could relate to them a little bit better than scientists. So he battled around a few ideas and then settled on the idea of making his protagonists undersea oil drillers working on a rig called the Deep Core. And undersea oil drilling wasn't really thing. I mean, it's possible, but it's incredibly expensive and incredibly dangerous and difficult to do. So while the technology exists to do it, not quite in the way that he puts it in the film. So you could kind of see the abyss as existing in a near future kind of environment, where something like that is happening more regularly, but it's believable.
I think there's definitely, I think if they were going to do a sequel to this, it'd be kind of fun to see like a Abyss mashed up with There Will Be Blood, just because I wanted to hear Ed Harris be like,
I don't know why your brain doesn't automatically go to, I'm sorry, I stepped all over your line.
No. I just wanted to hear Ed Harris say, the I drink your milkshake line.
Yeah. I just wish that somebody had the foresight to have made this same crew, who was left of them, be the ones that get sent to the asteroid in Armageddon.
Yes, that was the other thing I was thinking. Yes. Oh my God. Yeah,
that's good. One thing that really struck me this time watching it was how similar the oil rig workers are to the crew of the Nostromo in Ridley Scott's Alien. So, Dan O'Bannon conceived those characters as truckers in space. You could very well call these like truckers underwater or whatever.
Oh, for sure.
It's very similar. And then the Navy SEALs show up, and it's almost like the Marines from Cameron's Aliens invaded the like Nostromo. As I was watching this, I couldn't help but see like the similarities between the two. The difference here, though, is that the aliens in the Abyss aren't designed to inspire fear like the xenomorph does. They're not hostile. They're kind of more designed to inspire wonder and awe. So he's definitely going in a different direction than Alien, but the parallels are certainly there.
Yeah, it's definitely there. But he, I read several interviews with him where he talks a little bit about that and just basically saying, this was conceived right after Aliens, and why would I just want to make Aliens again underwater? Yeah. He was basically saying, I think an exact quote from here is that I'd done it once. I was happy with it. So why would I repeat that? I wanted to make the definitive monster movie with aliens, and I think I succeeded. I didn't want to challenge my own area. So the Abyss was always conceived as being exactly what it is.
Yeah. So when he was writing his treatment, James Cameron, ever the nerd, went really heavy on the science part of his science fiction, even rationalizing why the aliens, which he called NTIs, which they mentioned in the movie, it's short for non-terrestrial intelligence, which I would love that term for some reason. I think it's really fun. But he rationalizes why they live so far below the surface. So the pressure of the depths might be similar to the gravity on denser planets. And he thought that through. It wasn't just something he threw out there. It was something that he was trying to kind of ground in science. And here's how this is actually from his treatment. This is how Cameron describes the NTIs in his treatment for the Abyss. An extraterrestrial creature, bioluminescent like the deep sea fish. It has 4 arms and 2 legs, all long and slender, moving with a slow balletic grace. Its body and limbs are translucent, and it resembles a figure made out of blown glass. The head is refined and strangely anthropomorphic, with large eyes that convey a cold, dispassionate wisdom without malice. It is stunningly beautiful. So he's definitely not trying to inspire like fear, like the xenomorph, like what Gary was saying. He's not trying to repeat himself. He's trying to do something very, very different with these aliens.
When I was looking up reviews for like somebody needs a nap too, one of the things, like, some people were like, why were these people so in awe of the ships or whatever when they saw them? And besides, they look weird, but they were like, the undersea has these same kind of things, which, like you were saying, like these bioluminescent things like deep sea fish. But he says specifically when they went in, like this hot pink, like neon color that they have now, he said we went for colors that don't occur naturally underwater. He said they actually put a ban on anything red, yellow, magenta. Those are in like coral reef fish, and
right.
These wavelengths wouldn't propagate well through water, so it's supposed to give it like an otherworldly thing. So it would look weird to people that are used to seeing shit like that underwater.
But even so, like, they're still much further down than they would normally go, even as deep sea oil workers. So even if they saw a bioluminescent fish or something, they might be in awe. I actually watched, what's the name of it? The one of the James Cameron documentaries where he goes into the Atlantic Ocean, and they go to some of these places where there are bioluminescent fish, and it's fascinating to look even on a screen. It's like, how do these things exist? So I would be in awe. You don't get, I get excited when I see a Great Dane. I mean,
put me underwater. So would they if they saw one that deep,
right? Yeah. Well, yes. So, like Aliens, The Abyss was written to be an ensemble affair with a large cast of character actors taking on the role of the oil rig workers and of the Navy SEALs. But at the heart of that story are two characters, Bud and Lindsay, who are an estranged couple who are forced back into working together. And for the role of Bud, which I guess you would consider the hero of the film, actors such as Mel Gibson, Dennis Quaid, William Hurt, Harrison Ford, Kurt Russell, and Patrick Swayze's names were all floated. And I think that any of them could have probably been pretty good at it. But when Ed Harris came in to do a screen test for Bud wearing a motorcycle helmet, kind of as a dive helmet, it was pretty obvious that this was Bud. This was the guy.
Nice.
I've grown to really love that fucking guy, like especially after Night Riders.
Yeah, he's awesome, dude.
He's so likable.
He really is. He's very charismatic. He's very he's got a look where he is believable as a guy who works on like an oil rig. You know, like he's got the physique for it. He's pretty jacked. You know, but in a way where it doesn't look like he lifts weights. It looks like he just is strong from doing manual labor.
It's practical muscle.
Right. You know, and I don't know, there's something very charismatic about Ed Harris. I really love that guy.
I always think of him from The Rock.
Yeah,
as,
of course.
General Hummel.
Yeah, absolutely. And the studio, they actually didn't want Harris, despite being fairly well known at the time, especially after he had played John Glenn in The Right Stuff, which was a big hit. But he wasn't what 20th Century Fox considered leading man material. They were also concerned about his receding hairline, you know, because he doesn't look like a movie star. But Cameron saw this as a trait that added to his everyman appeal and made him more believable as a guy who would work on an oil rig. But Cameron did stick to his guns, obviously, as we know. Harris ended up winning the role. And then for the role of Lindsay, the studio threw out names like Jessica Lange, Deborah Winger, Jamie Lee Curtis, which she could have been pretty good in it. She got to do her own version of this later on down the line in Sphere, right? Wasn't she in Sphere?
It was that was it Cyber or Cypher or it's
that Jamie Lee was in?
Yeah.
It was like based off a comic, actually.
Yeah, it was based on a comic. Oh man.
Oh, what's the name of that? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio ended up being cast in the role, and she's not exactly like a household name.
She's made Marion.
Well, she's made Mary. She'd had some big roles. She had just come off back-to-back performances in Brian De Palma's Scarface and Martin Scorsese's The Color of Money with Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. So she had done some pretty significant stuff at the time. Although after like this and after Robin Hood, I haven't seen her in a lot of stuff, but I didn't really dive into why that is, or maybe it was a personal choice. You know,
she's apparently like was in a TV show for a while there called Blind Spot. She was in the Punisher TV series.
There was a Punisher TV series.
Well, the Netflix one, right?
The Netflix.
The Netflix one. She's in that.
Huh. She played Marion James. It says I don't remember this. I don't remember
her. It's been
in multiple episodes though, apparently. But she was also in the movie White Sands. If anybody's ever seen that,
heard of that movie.
It was right after Robin Hood, and you get to see her boobs in a more fun way than you do
in here when she's dead.
Listen, medical emergencies are very sexy.
That's the pull quote from this episode, honestly. So the relationship between Bud and Lindsay is at the film's heart, and it feels a lot more personal, I think, than what we normally get from a James Cameron script. He's not exactly known for highly emotional scripts, except for, I guess, Titanic. But that's because this was, in effect, a highly personal script for him. As he was preparing to start on The Abyss, Cameron's marriage to Gail Ann Hurd was actually falling apart. And while he was doing script rewrites and researching underwater film cameras, she's off producing Alien Nation. And each of them kind of retreated into their own separate projects and just kind of drifted apart from what I understand. I couldn't find a lot of detail. Neither of them have been super open about, what caused them to kind of fall, their marriage to fall apart. To me, it just seems like they just kind of drifted apart into their work.
Yeah, it didn't sound too nasty or anything, but like by the time that he's doing press for this at the end of it, they're already divorced.
Yeah, they're divorced. I mean, by the time pre-production began, they had already legally separated.
Yeah.
And so they were in the process of being divorced. But while their personal relationship was in shambles, Cameron still wanted his soon-to-be ex-wife by his side as producer because he respected her. And he's like, there's nobody else that I want to like film this insane underwater film. There's nobody else I would want by my side than Gail Ann Hurd, because he knew how good she was as a producer and he respected that. So she actually stayed on the film despite the fact that they were in the midst of a divorce for the entire production of the film.
Jeez.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So having a story about an estranged couple who are forced to work together, feels very personal, although obviously he was working on this script far before any of that started happening, but it doesn't feel like that much of a coincidence,
But yeah. I mean, there are some obvious, pull or, some lines of dialogue they pulled right straight from their life. Like when Ed Harris yells, "Fight, you bitch," and smacks her in the face. Then, I think that was like the day before for them.
Yeah, that's just James Cameron's regular directing style, I think.
Yeah, I thought it's just how he says hello.
Well, and he's actually talked about
how you met Ed Harris. Fight, you bitch.
Cameron actually has talked in interviews afterwards how he's like, yeah, I wish that I could say that Ed Harris's character in this is a parallel to me, but in truth, like he's a much better level-headed leader than I was at that time. Like wow. he fully admits it, He's like, I might have wanted to be Bud, but I was not Bud. So the rest of the crew of the Deep Core oil rig was made up of mainly character actors from New York City. You had Leo Burmester, who's my favorite. He plays Catfish. Todd Graff plays Hippie. John Bedford Lloyd, Kimberly Scott, who plays One Night. They're all great. I love them. And I love that there's not a lot of like recognizable faces in it. It makes them seem more realistic. And about a month before shooting began, they all underwent diving training together with the goal of getting them to work together as a team in real life before they had to do it in front of the camera. So they could have all learned to dive obviously on their own, but Cameron wanted them to work as a team. The exception was Ed Harris, because Ed Harris was a late hire. So he actually trained to dive while on the set of another movie that he was shooting, and then came and joined them afterwards, which is also kind of crazy to me. So for the villain of the piece, Cameron cast his old buddy Michael Biehn, so in a very different role. I think we talked about it on our Aliens episode, how Michael Biehn, outside of like Terminator and Aliens, he's almost always cast as villains. But James Cameron started that. It's his fault. It's Michael Bihn's fault too for being so good at being a bad guy, because he's very good at being a bad guy, I think.
Well, and I said it last episode, I think, where I was like, well, Cameron finally realizes it in this one that he's got one, but because even when he first comes in on this one, I still something about him I really liked him, but he's good at like once he starts losing his mind,
dude. He's very he plays an asshole very well in this movie. You love to hate him,
and that mustache really helps.
That mustache goes a long way.
He said that one of the interviews, somebody asked him like, how does it feel being Michael Bihn's personal employer? And he said, is it that unusual? I like working with key actors. If Martin Scorsese always uses Robert De Niro, why can't I use Michael? Especially, we work so well together. I worked with Michael again because I was able to give him a part totally opposite of anything he'd done before.
And Biehn had actually read an earlier version of the script, and he had talked Cameron into adding the detail that Lieutenant Coffey was suffering from the high pressure nervous syndrome, as an explanation for him becoming increasingly unhinged. I guess in the script as originally written, it was just like he started kind of being gradually more and more of an asshole, but it was Michael Biehn who suggested that they give this like scientific explanation for it. That wasn't James Cameron's idea. Yeah, so he and three other actors who were cast as the other SEALs, they all underwent their own training to help them be convincing as soldiers. So they're training separately from the rest of the cast, and that's also purposeful because he wanted them to not only feel like they work together as a team and as believable soldiers, but also they wanted to not feel connected to the rest of the cast because they are they have an antagonistic relationship. So you see this a lot on movies, but I always find it very interesting.
It is interesting. I don't know how you're supposed to accept that a crew doesn't get automatically curious about the guy when he gets so increasingly sweaty throughout the movie. And I don't trust anybody who sweats that much. I just don't. Like Jason Segel, he always looks sweaty, and I think he's a villain. Like at all times, there's something I don't trust about him.
That sweaty bastard.
he just looks like he's wet all the time, and I don't know why that is.
And not in a good way.
So, Todd, tell us what did your deep dive into the Trek universe turn up on this one?
Well, as we ask every week, who am I trekking with? We got a couple folks here. I'm going to start actually with Deborah Everton, the costume designer. Yeah, she
so
actually.
Does that mean we don't have any cast? Because normally you only go into something like costume design if there's no cast.
I'm well, the reason I'm covering her is because I feel I overlooked her.
Okay.
Because she also was the costume supervisor in the Terminator.
Okay. All right.
So she also was the costume designer in Star Trek First Contact, 1996, directed by Jonathan Frakes. And then we've got Mr. Darren Doctorman, who plays a news reporter here. And he's got a couple things.
He's like miscast.
His name's Dr. Man.
His name's
like
Dr. Man, and he's the news reporter.
He was in Star Trek The Motion Picture, the 2001 Director's Edition. He was in Star Trek Phase 2, credited as main title sequence for 4 episodes, animator for 2 episodes, modeler for 2 episodes, opening title sequence for 2 episodes, USS Enterprise model and space effects for 1 episode, visual effects for 1 episode, series consultant for 1 episode, and he played Claudius Marcus in Season 1, Episode 12, Bread and Savagery.
Wow. Well, I feel like for some weird reason, I'm always going to remember that a guy named Doctorman is in a lot of Star Trek shit.
Doctorman. Yeah. And Darren Doctorman. Like he's got the alliteration as well.
Wow.
He was also in the pilot episode of Star Trek Voyager from 1995. Oh. And he did props. He was the prop concept artist for Star Trek Beyond in 2016.
So he's an actor and like a props guy. It sounds like an
exactly.
effects guy. Wow.
Yeah, and he was also the concept artist for 10 episodes of Star Trek Picard.
Wow.
Now we've already mentioned Joe Farrago as the Anchorman, but he also played Anchorman in Terminator. But he did some stunts on Star Trek 6, Undiscovered Country in 1991. And then last but not least, Mr. Ken Jenkins, aka Dr. Bob Kelso from Scrubs.
Yeah.
As Gerard Kirkhill. He's in Star Trek. Yeah, Star Trek Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 1, Evolution from 1989.
Dr. Kelso
as Dr. Paul Stubbs. Yeah.
Oh, he just plays doctors, but Doctorman never played a doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
Kelso.
And that's everybody in Star Trek.
Thank you, Todd.
There it is.
So as you may remember from the first episode in the series, if you listened to that Terminator episode, and if you made it through the 3.5 hours or whatever that it lasted, James Cameron started taking diving lessons as a teenager. And it's something that he continued to do into adulthood, pushing it further and further, far beyond what one might consider a hobby. Like he was pretty obsessive about it. It was a big part of his life. And as many of our listeners might already know, in the 12 years between Titanic and Avatar, Cameron directed and starred in several underwater documentaries. And in 2012, he became the first person to do a solo descent to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of Earth's ocean, 36,000 feet below the surface of the water. For those keeping score, that's nearly 7 miles below the surface of the water. Nobody had ever done that by themselves before. In fact, the last time, and the only other time actually, that someone had attempted to go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench was in 1960. And that time the submersible had 2 passengers in it, not just one. The plexiglass windows of their submersible cracked under the pressure. And the 2 men spent only 20 minutes on the ocean floor before turning back. And then no one even attempted the dive again for more than half a century, when Cameron did so in a submersible that he actually helped design and build along with his engineering team, which includes his brother Mike, which was a project that took 7 years.
Wow.
And there's a documentary about this too. It's called Deep Sea Challenge. He did not direct that one, but there is a documentary about his descent to the Mariana Trench that I hope to watch here soon. And if you're wondering about the timeline, by the way, 2012 was when that dive took place. He had spent 7 years working on this project. That means that while he was working on this, he was simultaneously reinventing 3D technology for Avatar. He's doing this stuff. It's all happening at the same time. Isn't that wild?
Overachiever.
Yeah. So the question is, though, why did Cameron do this? Why did he spend years of his life working on something like this? I mean, he's a filmmaker, but why are you working so obsessively for almost a decade on trying to go to the deepest part of the ocean by yourself? Later on, he said in an interview, quote, "I like doing things I know others can't." And that's been something of a motto for Cameron for his whole career, doing things that others can't do, or things that other people just won't do, or aren't crazy enough to do, or aren't willing to put in the effort to like make happen when somebody says that they're impossible. So when it came time to film The Abyss, he really put those words into practice.
To be fair, just so we pointed out, I mean, as a side note, this is also essentially the basis for Justin's mom's pornographic but very brave OnlyFans account. Doing things others can't, or things others won't do. Doing things other people won't put in the effort to try to do.
Anyway, with The Abyss, Cameron planned on shooting with water in ways that nobody else had attempted before. He wanted to photograph real actors in an underwater soundstage, complete with sets, lights, and recording sound. And nobody had ever done this before at all, because it's insane. But as we know so well about Cameron, even already, 3 episodes in, someone telling him that he can't or shouldn't do something is only going to motivate him to do it even more, because he wants to prove that it's possible.
He's a non-paralyzed John Locke.
Right?
Don't you tell me what I can't do.
I mean, remember, he had been told not to make Aliens. It was a major success. And during the shooting of that film, even Stan Winston was unsure if his idea for a 14-foot tall alien queen puppet would work. And it did. He pitched the Terminator idea to his agent. His agent didn't believe him, so he fired his agent and made it without him. So Cameron at this time is learning to listen to his instincts rather than the prevailing wisdom about how movies should be made. So in the past, underwater scenes in movies had usually been shot on a soundstage using the dry for wet technique, which is where the director creates the illusion of a scene being underwater through the use of smoke and slow motion photography. Either that, or they would use stunt divers to stand in for the actors for scenes shot in deep water. Then they would cut in shots of the actual actors in close up. They were usually filmed like in a swimming pool somewhere safe. If there was any other movie that came anywhere close to having the sheer amount of underwater photography as Cameron was hoping for, it was the 1977 film The Deep, starring Nick Nolte, Jacqueline Bisset, and Robert Shaw. And it was based on a novel by Peter Benchley, the guy who wrote Jaws, and the Deep is very much just a shameless attempt to cash in on the popularity of Jaws, which had come out 2 years earlier. And of course, the casting of Robert Shaw would probably clue you in on that. And it's not like, have you guys ever seen The Deep? It's not a great movie. It's not terrible. It's not very memorable at all.
I don't remember it if I've seen it.
Yeah. It's not very memorable, but it does have some pretty great underwater photography. And the guy responsible for shooting that underwater photography was a guy named Al Giddings. Now, Giddings is a fun character in this story, and he's going to be probably part of Cameron's story for quite a few years after this. I'm sure we'll mention him on other episodes. But he's this big, like, burly 6'2", 240-pound ex-spear fisherman, competitive swimmer. He had turned his love of the sea into a career as the go-to guy for underwater cinematography. At this point, he'd already filmed several award-winning underwater nature documentaries, and he had started to develop a reputation as a modern-day Jacques Cousteau. So this is a guy after Cameron's own heart. Like Cameron, he had a mind for engineering. The filming equipment that he had used on The Deep were of his own design. He's very, very similar to Cameron in that way. Plus, he's this big burly man's man, and we know Cameron likes those kind of dudes, and Cameron is one of those type of dudes. This guy who his athleticism actually helped during these grueling underwater shoots, because it's very, very hard on your body to be underwater for that long. And the two got along really well when Cameron flew out to meet him, and it wouldn't take long before he was hired as the Abyss's underwater director of photography. So he's responsible for everything being shot underwater.
Man, I was looking him up just now just to see what he looks like, because I was picturing like Quint in my mind or something.
No, he's pretty clean cut, and yeah. He's
a
big
ready
dude,
for it.
But...
Cameron goes into the bowl goes into the reactor. Abyss is in the reactor.
Yeah, they interview him a good bit on the Abyss making of documentary. So Cameron had never had any intention of shooting any of this on the open ocean, or at least very little. There's some model work of the boat that they launch off of. That was a miniature, by the way. It's still like a 40-foot long miniature, but it was a miniature shot on the ocean. But most of this he had not planned on shooting in the actual ocean. Hollywood had kind of learned its lesson after the difficulties that Steven Spielberg had on Jaws. I don't know if you've ever heard, but Jaws was not an easy movie to shoot.
Yeah, right.
So,
yeah.
I mean, when you're shooting on the ocean, you have to worry about storms and tides and visibility. The water's always moving. The sun's always moving in the background. Not to mention
sharks never stay on their mark.
Sharks, they're terrible actors. Not to mention that salt water will corrode all of your equipment. It's very difficult. It's too dangerous. It's too unpredictable. And most importantly, to the folks writing the checks at the studio, it is far too expensive to shoot on the open ocean. Although
craft services at the bottom of the ocean, not as tasty as you might think.
Just the crusty crabs is your only choice.
Exactly.
So Cameron had instead planned on shooting in a tank, which is, an environment that he could control, where he would build the set for the deep core and his other underwater sets. And he looked everywhere. He looked all over the world, like in all different countries. And he looked at every tank that was available, and none of them were big enough for what he needed. Then he received a phone call from a guy named Earl Owensby. Earl Owensby, I wish I could find a lot more information on him than I could, because his career seems fascinating. He seems like a really interesting person to me. But he was an actor / producer known as the Drive-In King of the South. He had begun his career by producing and starring in a movie called Challenge, where he played the lead role, a guy named Frank Challenge, who was a U.S. senator who goes on a roaring rampage of revenge after his family is murdered, because he wouldn't go along with this. I think they're called like the Syndicate or something, and he didn't want to be in their pocket, so he didn't go along with them, and they murdered his family, one of those kind of movies.
Wow.
And it actually had a sequel, Challenge, and its sequel, The Brass Ring. They were the first films produced by the production company that Owensby had recently founded, called fittingly Earl Owensby Studios. So for the first 6 or so years that they existed, every film that EO Studios produced starred Owensby. That was his career. He just made his own movies, But then in 1980, they began to branch out. Their first non-Owensby movie went to, or the first non-Owensby starring role went to David Allan Coe in a movie called Lady Grey, which I had no idea that David Allan Coe ever acted. I had no idea.
So it's just, as I'm looking over the notes, it occurs to me. So Earl Owensby was in charge of Earl Owensby Studios, also known as EO. And so he was in charge. So does that make him Captain EO?
I knew exactly where you were going with that.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate it, Todd.
No. I should have left that one up in the old brain bucket. I apologize. I'm better than that. Than that.
That's a Francis Ford Coppola film.
Yeah. Hey,
technically,
you know what? I'm going to switch sides and say, yeah, of course I'll make that joke. Now that I know it's got Coppola connection.
Right. That's true cinema.
Yeah.
So Owensby continued to produce successful films, mostly low budget action movies for the grindhouse circuit. He was very successful doing that. And then in 1987, he was ready to expand his small burgeoning movie empire just a little bit more. And by doing so, he purchased a never completed Cherokee nuclear power plant just outside the big city of Gaffney, South Carolina.
Right under the peach.
Right under the peachoid. So listeners of the show, if you don't know, we're based in South Carolina. We're about an hour's drive from Gaffney, probably.
Yeah.
And I had no idea that there was an unfinished nuclear power plant there. I had no idea there was a movie studio there. Gaffney isn't really much of a town. It's mostly known for an outlet mall and a giant water tower that's shaped like a peach that looks like a giant butt on the side of the interstate. If you do know Gaffney and you don't live in this area, it's because you saw it on House of Cards, where it makes an appearance early on in the series, where Kevin Spacey's out there under the peachoid. I want to go find this place, guys.
I do too. I think we might need to do a Cinema Shock field trip.
I really want. I don't think it's in use anymore as a movie studio, but I would really like to go find that place.
I think that would be a nice way to cap off our James Cameron series.
Yeah, Gaffney's not very big, and it can't be hard to find a nuclear reactor.
I found a Reddit where someone had taken pictures, like in 2014 was the most recent, and somebody in the Reddit thread said all the stuff had been taken down in the past couple of years or something.
Oh, really?
But yeah, like as far as the Abyss sets or whatever, because I was totally like, man, why have we not done this? This should be a thing we go look at.
Yeah, for real. I mean, I could not believe I've seen this movie quite a few times, and I had no idea that it was filmed an hour from where I'm sitting. And I mean, obviously, for a lot of people, I mean, we live 2 hours from Atlanta, and the Marvel movies are filmed there. It's not a big deal, but it's Atlanta. It's like a big city. Of course, they're filming movies there, but Gaffney, South Carolina, like that really shocked me because Gaffney is just a nothing little burg that literally just has an outlet mall at it and a Fats Cafe right underneath the peach.
Exactly.
But the Cherokee nuclear power plant out there was an energy project that was started by Duke Energy in the early 1970s, but construction on the 3-reactor plant was stalled due to economic problems, and by the early 1980s it was abandoned. So Earl Owensby bought the empty plant with the plan to turn it into an independent movie studio. So he contacted Cameron because he thought the plant's large rectangular turbine pits might just be the perfect location for Cameron to build his underwater sets. So Cameron flies out to South Carolina with Giddings at his side, and Owensby kind of gives him the tour around the site. And Cameron's pretty impressed with what he saw, or at least he saw the potential in what he saw. He saw that it could, make for a pretty good location. And he liked the turbine pits that Owens had that's why he brought him out here to show him these big turbine pits. Cameron liked he saw the potential in those turbine pits, but while he was touring the facilities, he looked off in the distance. And this is like, when I say the distance, it's like a mile away. These nuclear facilities are enormous. And he sees this giant concrete bowl. And this enormous bowl was supposed to have been the nuclear reactor's containment vessel. So when they put the reactor in, it's like, 8 feet of concrete. Once it's completed, it's gas sealed so that nothing from the reactor gets into the outside world, And it had only been half finished before the project was abandoned. So it was half of a sphere essentially. So it's just a bowl. It was 240 feet in diameter with an 80-foot walls and no entrance. They're looking at it. And by the way, the day that they're touring this facility, it's just like, it's like it is outside right now. It's just howling rain and wind. And it's like, it's not a nice day. But Cameron is not going to let that stop him. He starts walking towards this reactor or this containment vessel. And there's a giant crane next to it, which was the crane they were using to construct it. They had just, I guess when they abandoned the project, they abandoned all the equipment there too. So Cameron and Giddings climbed to the top of this crane about 110 feet in the air. So they're actually over the bowl in the howling wind and rain so that they could get a better look at it. And they're looking down at this enormous concrete bowl that's filled with, a decade's worth of dirty brown rainwater. And Cameron is inspired. Those kind of engineering gears start turning in his brain. He starts seeing what he could do with this. So him and Giddings, they're at the top of this crane and they start talking about it, started to discuss like how they could build the deep core set here, how they could build the cliff face that it was, on the edge of the abyss, all in this giant tank because it's that big. And by the time they climbed back down the ladder off of that crane, they had a plan in place for what they wanted to do. But it wasn't going to be easy. This was going to be more than just the world's largest underwater set. It was going to be a feat of industrial engineering that would involve pouring thousands of pounds of industrial concrete, installing these huge filtration systems and pumps, and a row of 20,000 heaters to warm the 7.5 million gallons of water that the tank would hold. And this is just one of the many innovative and sort of insane solutions that Cameron was going to have in order to realize his vision for the abyss. A lot of the equipment that he was going to need to pull it off like literally just did not exist yet. But one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to be able to clearly see the actors' faces in the underwater scenes. Because what's the point of training all your actors to dive if all you're going to see are, their eyes? And, a normal dive suit, all you see are the eyes, and then you've got the regulator over the mouth. So you can't really see anything. So he brought in Ron Cobb. Remember Ron Cobb? We talked about him on Aliens and Alien. He was one of the Dan O'Bannon's guys, the production designer. So Cobb comes in and designs a concept for a dive helmet with a full clear faceplate, so you can see the actor's entire face. And then that design was manufactured by a company called Western Space and Marine. But Cameron didn't want to just see the actors' faces. He also wanted to hear their voices, and he wanted to do it by recording their dialogue in real time not in ADR. And that meant that he had to figure out a way to record their dialogue while they were underwater. You can't exactly like hold a boom mic over their head.
Right.
So, of course, as we said, a typical diving regulator fits into a driver's mouth, which makes it a little bit difficult to talk. So Western Space and Marine built the regulator into the side of the helmet that Cobb had designed, allowing fresh air to cycle through the helmet as needed without a mouthpiece. You can see it in the movie. It's like it's on their right. It's like to the side, and you can see the bubbles like popping out of it as they talk. And WSM also incorporated microphones, the same kind of that were used in fighter aircraft helmets for pilots to talk to each other. They put those inside of the helmets as well so that they could record the dialogue. The helmets did make a pretty bad noise as air was coming out. This like really annoying, I don't even know how to describe it. It just goes like every time they talk. And they actually had to edit that out in post because it was so irritating to listen to every time that somebody talked.
Yeah, they talk a lot in some interviews too with about how he pushes the envelope on all these things. Like he always tries to think of new and industrious ways of accomplishing things. But he talks that particular one is one he says that may be true, but you don't always get the equivalent value on screen for going the extra miles like I try to do. And that example was a specific one he gave. He says, we had actors in diving suits speaking dialogue being recorded live underwater. The audience doesn't perceive that as outstanding, though, because we've seen 20 years of helmet movies and it's always faked. It doesn't even occur to people it was done differently with fabulous equipment, and it may not seem that remarkable to anybody else, but it was. But he says we didn't really, get the showmanship value out of it as much as the difficulty level. But
well, yeah, I mean, was it worth the difficulty? Probably not. I mean, they could have recorded the dialogue in ADR and just the actors would have still been speaking on set, so you still would have got the bubbles, and the audience wouldn't have known otherwise.
Yeah, they wouldn't have. He said though they tried to adopt this motif of do everything as realistically as possible.
Yeah,
I mean, the craziest one to me was just in that tank, the descent that Ed Harris has to do into the abyss. I mean, that was straight up built along the up the wall, like a 50-foot drop. And it was the only thing Ed Harris actually didn't do in the movie. They had like another trained diver actually do the drop. But I mean, that's legitimately a dude just like dropping 50 feet in the water, like it's just, I don't know, insane. They said there was like special training though, that it could like fuck with your inner ear and all kinds of stuff. So
going down that quickly.
Yeah.
So Cameron actually had his own helmet made as well, the same as what the actors were wearing, so that he could direct from underwater. And they created an underwater PA system so that Cameron and only Cameron could be heard by the cast and crew. So there's an underwater PA system connected to his microphone, but nobody else's microphone were connected to it. So he would have to direct actors by talking to this, and they would have to signal back to him either like with hand signals or him reading lips. In fact, when they did instead of the slate that they do at the beginning of each take, that's to the reason you click that down is to get a sync between sound and picture to make sure it's the same. So obviously you can't really do that underwater. So they would take the slate and just like bonk it on their head so that the microphone inside of their helmet would pick it up, and it works, but it looked really silly if you look at the behind the scenes footage, because they'll be about to do this like intense scene, but it starts off with them going bonk, and then the actors would have to like giggle for a little bit, like every single time before they got into the scene, just to like get it out of their system, because it was such a goofy way to start your scene. Another practical issue when it came to shooting underwater was the lighting. So normally when you're shooting underwater, you really just have to hope that you've got enough light for an exposure if you're shooting like in a real environment. And ambient lighting, which is what's typically you typically see in a film, wouldn't really work for the abyss, because their underwater sequences were shot they were supposed to be in the blackest depths of the ocean where no natural light would penetrate. So all the lighting had to come from practical sources. They had to come from like the deep core, the subs, or from the divers themselves. So, which is pretty difficult to do. You couldn't just have like light off screen that couldn't be explained, because it would kill the effect of them being so far underwater. So Cameron sent his friend John Bruno, who was John Bruno was a visual effects artist. He had helped create the Ghost and Poltergeist and Ghostbusters. He sends him down to the Cayman Islands, out where Cameron's short story had been set, with some still cameras and a couple submarines. And Bruno dived down 700 feet below the surface to take photos of the blue-black undersea world, that area where there's not much light. And those images would serve as inspiration for Cameron and Michael Solomon, who by this time had been hired as the director of photography on land or any of the dry scenes. And he was also responsible for supervising the underwater lighting, because, Al Giddings, he's the director of photography underwater, but he was mostly used to shooting documentary style, not like lighting a scene. So Michael Solomon was in charge of, kind of coordinating the lighting on the underwater sequences as well, even though he wasn't physically ever under the water shooting, because that wasn't his expertise. At this point, they know what they want the underwater scenes to look like, but they had to also get hundreds of lights that were bright enough to light these enormous sets, and they were also safe enough to stick in a giant bowl of water with 30 or so people walking around in it. Michael Biehn in some interviews talks about that. He's like, I was always taught as a kid not to like get the lamp near the water, and I'm being asked to like jump in a giant pool that's filled with lights. Most of the lights that are like normally used for underwater filming weren't powerful enough for what they needed. The engineers at a company called Hydro Image invented something for this. It was a powerful 1200 watt metal halide lamp called the CPAR. So they invented this just for The Abyss, and the CPAR would go on to be used in a ton of other movies, including Michael Bay's Armageddon, which is a second shout out that movie's already gotten this time. I just can't wait for our further viewing segment later. And it also got used in National Geographic nature films. It's also the only underwater lighting that NASA allows in their indoor pool in Houston, which is where they train astronauts in weightlessness. But it was invented for The Abyss. And this is one of several pieces of equipment that were invented specifically for this film. All right, so that's another problem solved, which just means that that's a check off the list, and we're on to the next problem. And the next problem was that because they were shooting not in the actual ocean, they were shooting in a tank. Well, first of all, water, you guys may know, water is reflective.
So, I've heard that about water.
Yeah. So once the tank is filled, because it's in a tank and not the ocean, it's completely still across the top, right? There's no like waves or anything. It's completely still. And that creates a mirror on the underside of the surface. So, the actors would look up and they would just see a reflection of themselves, which would also kill the illusion of them being thousands of miles, or thousands of feet rather, underwater. So they were trying to figure out a way to do this, or like, we could put a tarp on it, or, they're batting around ideas on how to fix this. And the solution came from Al Giddings, who he tested his idea in his own swimming pool. And basically he bought a bunch of black propylene beads. They're tiny, about the size of BBs. And he built a floating grid to hold them all on the surface of the water. And then they just dumped all these beads on the water because they float. From below, they block out all of the light. It just creates this like black field over the top. But they also, because of their beads, if there was an emergency, divers could burst through to the surface of the water without them. Although the actors did complain about finding like these tiny beads in like their ears and various other orifices for like weeks after shooting.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So overcoming all of these technical hurdles was kind of fun for Cameron, at least early on, because he's the kind of guy, he's got the engineer brain. He likes to find solutions to problems, and that's what they're doing. They're finding solutions. He always loved hands-on science. It gave them an opportunity to kind of flex those muscles. He also enlisted the help of his brother, Mike, who had, by this time in the mid-late 80s, he had been working as a mechanical engineer for quite a few years. And on The Abyss, one of Mike's biggest contributions was a device called the Sea Wasp, because you can't do traditional like dolly shots underwater. You can't really build a dolly underwater and just roll a camera on it. That's not possible. So, but Cameron wanted a way to move his camera smoothly and quickly inside of the tank to make it look like a dolly shot, basically. And the Sea Wasp was this vehicle that Mike Cameron created, that he invented, that could tow two divers, but was also small and nimble enough to rise and descend very easily, and allow the camera operator to stay on the subject. It's pretty cool to see in motion. If you look up some of the behind the scenes stuff on the Abyss, you can see them using this thing, and it's pretty neat. Mike Cameron also has a small cameo in the film. He plays the corpse in the submarine that has a live crab crawl out of its mouth. That's the cameo. That's the cameo that James Cameron gave his brother, and they had to do like 4 or 5 takes on it. That just feels like somebody picking on their little brother.
I was going to say he's still down there waiting for reshoots, so that's what James Cameron thinks of his brother.
Yeah, funny that of all the people he could have gotten to do that shot, it was his little brother. So in April of 1988, the Abyss's art department rolled into Gaffney, and they start building the deep core. The turbine pits that Owensby had first showed Cameron became the place where the production would shoot miniatures and subs. It became known as B tank, but A tank, the main tank was the giant concrete bowl where deep core was being built. And A tank was supposed to be ready to shoot by August of that year, but due to engineering delays, it wasn't even close to being finished by then. Cameron started shooting what he could in B tank and on some of the dry sets, but by September, deep core still wasn't ready. Once it was done, it was going to take an additional 5 days just to fill A tank with water. Remember, it's 7.5 million gallons of water. It was going to take 5 days to fill, plus time.
A lot of trips to the grocery store.
Yeah, plus time to heat and filter it, which it's going to take a long time to heat 7.5 million gallons of water. Todd, you're just cracking up.
I'm sorry. I just pictured some lowly PA like cracking open Aquafinas and just like
that's what I was
another one.
Or like milk jugs.
Just like they were actually grabbing water from a nearby lake. So this is lake water they're putting in, which makes the filtration system even that much more important because they had to filter it to where it was crystal clear so they could shoot in it.
At any time they had to pee. Cameron's just like, go over there. We got a whole place for that.
Cameron got impatient and actually started filling A tank with water while workers were still inside of it. Like he's like, fuck it, we got to go. Let's go. And so water is slowly rising beneath them, and the crew is standing on these skiffs, painting the set, working day and night to finish it before the whole thing was underwater.
You can see pictures of that too. Like there's little things. I think all the extras on the DVD or something. I can't remember where I saw it, but it's like you can see them like working while the water is like they're watching the water level rise up and they're just trying to get done. Cameron's like, I will fucking kill you.
Yeah, I will murder you.
Done. Literally.
You have 2 choices. You can finish or you can drown. So there were other problems and delays even after construction was complete. They had thunderstorms, they had pipe ruptures, they had water clarity problems. When you're working with 7.5 million gallons of water, it can't always be crystal clear all the time. A tank was so big that it actually created its own weather. So some days the crew would show up to shoot and it would just be too murky to work with. They couldn't shoot in it. They would have to clarify it. One of the weirder production delays involved some rogue Gaffney goats that wandered in. They wandered into B tank, the turbine pits, and started chewing on equipment and jumping on the walls and tumbling off of them, and then pissing and shitting all over the set.
The famous Gaffney goats.
I was going to say, for those of you who aren't from South Carolina, the Gaffney goats are a local street gang.
It's just what we call people from Gaffney.
Right.
It's just the locals.
We don't call them locals.
Yeah, we just call them the Gaffney goats. Y'all making a movie here? And then
they're the townies of Gaffney.
Then they just shit on the floor.
I mean, you're not pointing the camera this way, right? So I can just go ahead and drop a deuce.
Well, the good part is they see goat, greatest of all time, so they take it as a compliment, and it works.
And all these problems I'm describing. Remember, the film hasn't even started shooting yet. This is all pre-production. The shoot itself brought its own set of problems, and there were quite a lot of them. First of all, shooting days averaged 15 to 18 hours every day. Crew members would spend the shoot about 30 feet underwater, and it took a while to get the pH levels in the tank right. Because remember, they were having these water clarity problems, so they would add chlorine, but initially there was too much chlorine, and it started crew members, their hair started falling out and changing colors, and their skin started burning from the amount of chlorine in it. Didn't really affect the actors because they were all in these like full body suits, but some of the crew members were having it pretty rough. They would shoot sometimes underwater for up to 5 hours at a time, and when the cast and crew would emerge from the water, they were shaky and unstable. It's hard being under that much water pressure for that long of a time. They'd finish shooting, they'd come out, and they would climb into plastic hot tubs that had been set up to the side of the set. And Fox considered the hot tubs to be an indulgence. They thought that they were just like lounging in hot tubs. Like, why did you buy hot tubs for the set? And they gave Gala and Heard some shit about buying them. But once the shoot moved into the fall and winter, those hot tubs became the only place on the set that was warm enough for the crew to eat lunch or hold meetings. Because remember, this is all outdoors. Like, this set is outdoors. This tank is outdoors. It's uncovered. There was a tarp over it at one point, and then there was like a thunderstorm and the tarp ripped, and it was going to take too long. The tarp was over it really not to keep them from the weather, but to keep the sunlight out so that it would, increase the darkness. And once that ripped, they kind of decided that it would be too time consuming and expensive to fix. So Cameron's just like, well, I guess we're on night shoots now. And the rest of the shoot was all on nights. They were shooting in the middle of the night, which makes it even more difficult,
Yeah.
So the cast and crew grew pretty exhausted and irritable, as you can imagine. A lot of them started coming down with ear and sinus infections. Like, people were getting sick. Like, it is not a fun time. And decompression was also an issue, especially for Cameron and Giddings, who spent more time than anyone else underwater. At the end of each shooting day, because even under 30 feet of water, that's a considerable amount of water pressure on you. And at the end of each shooting day, they would have to hang 10 feet under the surface for an hour. They couldn't come all the way out because the pressure change was too much. They had to kind of hover about 10 feet below the surface of the water for an hour just to allow their body to adjust to the change in pressure. And not, not one to waste time. Cameron, he wasn't just going to hang there. So he had his crew install a monitor in the underwater control room so that he could actually watch dailies while he's hanging there. And he would have phone calls from like the studio pumped into his helmet so that he could talk while he was hanging there underwater, because Cameron's just the kind of guy, it seems like, who can't sit still. He's not just going to lounge. He's not going to take a nap.
Well, and nitrogen's a huge part of that too. So like, even when he went home at night, like, he was having to put on a breathing mask and like take an aspirin and breathe.
Yeah, I think he had to breathe like pure oxygen, right?
Yeah, he had to breathe pure oxygen at night so that it would cleanse out the nitrogen that was in his system, because he had to go do the same shit for 10 hours the next day.
Yeah, it's wild.
He said, I think he spent like a total of 550 hours in a diving helmet to make the Abyss.
That's great. That's insane.
God.
Yeah, he said that's well beyond all that one would associate with this job, and I will never do that again.
Yeah. He's said multiple times that, like, would I do it the way I did it? No. If I were to do it again, probably not. But I mean, that's, you kind of think he's spending more time on a daily basis underwater than overwater. If he's spending 12 to 15 hours a day underwater, it's crazy. And everything about shooting water underwater is very difficult, as you can imagine. The helmets were unwieldy and heavy. They weighed about 40 pounds, and they were strapped to their like buoyancy vests. So if you took off the helmet, you still had the weight of a 40-pound helmet hanging off of you. And Cameron, who remember is wearing the same helmet, he was also weighted down with an additional 40 pounds of weights that were attached to his waist and ankles so that he could walk around the bottom of the set with a camera. Say what you will about him, the guy is motivated, and he will do whatever it takes to get this movie made. Like, he's holding a camera and he's shooting this stuff himself. Him and Giddings are shooting the majority of it. So during the shooting of one scene, actually, Cameron was so absorbed in his work that he didn't realize that he had run out of oxygen, which is a problem. So he went to give Master Antonio, he was actually trying to give her direction, talking to her through his, the PA system, and he realized he couldn't take a breath. And Al Giddings is underwater with him, but he's got his back to Cameron, and the other crew members that were there were either on the surface or they were off in the distance, like putting up some lighting, and he couldn't get anyone's attention. He's like, he can't speak. He's trying to make like hand motions, and he can't get anyone's attention. Well, he could speak. He still had his microphone, but he didn't have any breath to be able to get the words out. So he jerks his helmet off. But remember, he's still at the bottom of a 7.5 million gallon tank. He's 35 feet below the surface. And that helmet is still attached to him, that 40-pound helmet. He's also in total darkness. So he can't see what he's doing. He's having to feel his way around. He eventually finds the release for the buoyancy vest, which releases the vest and the helmet, and he begins ascending to the surface. I did some reading on diving while doing this, because I have no experience in it at all. Although I would like to learn. I would like to go diving. I think it would be really fun. But when someone ascends to the surface, the change in pressure, as we mentioned, is an issue. The diver has to breathe out as they descend, or as they ascend, excuse me, releasing air from their lungs as they're going up. They're blowing bubbles out in a technique that divers call a blow and go, which is also the name of a side hustle that Gary's mom used to run. If I remember.
Got it in there. That's good. That's good.
Nice.
If the diver fails to breathe out, the compressed air in his lungs will expand as the pressure changes, and eventually his lungs will explode, which I can't imagine is a very pleasant way to go.
No. It'll ruin your weekend.
That'll ruin it. So Cameron, though, remember, he's a trained diver, so he knew this. So he's blowing out bubbles while he's kicking like a madman because he got rid of the buoyancy vest, but he still has ankle weights on. So he's kicking, trying to get to the surface with ankle weights on. And finally, so they had these safety divers on set. Every actor had a safety diver that would watch them. If they made a motion that they were in trouble, the diver was ready to go and rescue them at all time. So one of these divers, a guy named George, noticed that Cameron was in distress, and he sped out to help him. And safety divers they're trained to stop panic drivers from ascending so that they don't explode their lungs. So George stopped Cameron about 15 feet from the surface, and he gave Cameron his backup regulator so he could get some oxygen. Unfortunately, that backup regulator was faulty. So when Cameron tried to breathe in, he just inhaled a bunch of water. So it's making things worse. Yeah. So he's choking, and he thinks that maybe he just, did it wrong. He tries it again, another mouthful of water. His lungs are filling with water. He's about to black out. And George, this whole time, George is holding him down to keep him from ascending, because he doesn't want him to go to the surface. I guess he doesn't know that Cameron's a trained diver and was doing the blow and go thing the whole time. So he was getting the air out of his lungs. So George is holding him, and he tried to pull away, but George, he thinks that Cameron is just panicking. So he's like holding him really tight and trying to get him to breathe from this regulator, which Cameron at this point knows is not working correctly. So just as he's about to pass out and probably die, Cameron pulled out all the punches, like literally. He punched George in the face as hard as he could, which it can only be so hard underwater, honestly. But Cameron's a pretty big dude, so he punches George in the face, and George lets go, and Cameron swims to the surface and, lives. Obviously, we know we would have heard had Cameron died on the set of the Abyss. So he's okay, but he's pissed. He's pissed off. He's pissed off for a couple of reasons. One, he's pissed off at George because George gave him a faulty regulator, and George almost caused him to drown. So he fired George by the end of that day. He also fired his assistant director because his assistant director was supposed to warn Cameron when he was getting low on oxygen, because Cameron getting absorbed in his work and getting low on oxygen was a common occurrence. And one of the AD's jobs was to time it, and when he was getting down to where he had like 15 minutes left, he was supposed to let Cameron know, and he forgot to do it this day. So he got fired too.
He earned it.
Yeah. Causing your boss to almost die is a pretty good reason to get fired, honestly.
I wonder what their side of the story was that day when they went to the bar afterwards.
Yeah.
They were like, well, it's fucking Cameron. If he'd everybody's always got their other side.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. There's two sides to every story. So on our aliens episode, we talked about the famous tea trolley mutiny. And I said something about that being, that could possibly be where Cameron's reputation for being kind of a hard ass began, even though I think we all agreed on that one, that the crew members were kind of being the dicks in that particular case.
Yeah.
But to them, Cameron was being the dick, but it was really on the set of The Abyss that Cameron started to become known as a tyrant. I joked about this in one episode. It might've been on the Aliens, that there were crew members on the set that would wear t-shirts that said something like, I'm not afraid of anything. I worked on The Abyss, or something like that. Crew members would call it the abuse. They like change the clapboard to say the abuse.
That's funny.
They would call it Son of the Abyss, things like that. They had a lot of good names for it. But as we've already documented so far, the shooting days on The Abyss were incredibly tough. But James Cameron, we know he is not the kind of guy who's going to be deterred by a tough day, but he also expects everyone else to be as tough as he is, to be as dedicated as he is.
Oh yeah.
And he worked at a relentless pace, and he would criticize anyone who couldn't keep up. He would call them wussies, if they couldn't keep up, and they couldn't put in the long days that he was putting in, then they weren't up to snuff. And the actors had it particularly tough on set. You got to remember, none of them are like, they're not divers. They learn to dive, but this is not their life. They're actors. They're playing characters. So they're having to do all this technical stuff while still, creating characters, which is incredibly difficult. A couple scenes that stood out. One is the one where Ed Harris and Catfish have to swim underwater without their gear on, and they had to do that like 5 or 6 times, and they're literally swimming underwater with no breathing gear on, and they're exhausted by the end of it. Oof. There was one scene where Harris has to descend the wall of the abyss, and he had to hold his breath inside of a helmet filled with pink liquid while he was towed the entire length of the set, which is about 200 feet. Because regardless of the fact that, there have been experiments in human liquid breathing, on the set of this movie, that was just Ed Harris in a helmet filled with water, filled with a pink liquid. So he was having to hold his breath the entire time he had that helmet on, with he had some contacts that helped him be able to focus underwater. Normally you can't focus underwater. But yeah, he's holding his breath the entire time and trying to make it look like he's not holding his breath the entire time, which is pretty tough.
Jeez.
Hey, didn't you, you had a video that you sent us, Todd, about breathable liquid. Is it possible? Did you get to did you, I didn't watch the whole video.
Basically I saw an article, and it's in the works. It's in short. Yeah. We'll put the video. We'll put that link available on our social media. But
and as we'll get into, they did actually use that technology on the set, but they didn't use it on people.
The biggest problem they have with it is the separation of, I think, the nitrogen or something. It doesn't, they can't nail that down. He actually even called, in one interview I saw, he said they even called the diver that he had seen as a kid and had him come and show them exactly what mixture he was using.
Well, they actually, it wasn't the diver on that
he said in the interview, I saw you in your notes, you said some guy from Duke, but in the interview, this was straight from Cameron's mouth. He said, I called the diver that I saw when I was a kid and brought him back on set to show us exactly the mixture he used.
Huh. Interesting. I'll get into what I found in my research, which is, I think, came out of that, the Futurist book, which, they interviewed Cameron for as well. So, but again, this is almost 40 years ago. So, people's memory is whatever. But during one take, Ed Harris signaled that he was out of air, and a safety diver was nowhere to be found, or he had gotten caught on something along those lines. But another diver rushed in, opened Harris's faceplate, and shoved a regulator in his mouth. But it was upside down, so all he got was a big gulp of water. And then finally, Al Giddings rushed in to give Harris his own regulator so that he could breathe. But Ed Harris basically also almost drowned on the set of this movie. And he said that at the end of that day, he got in his car to go back to his hotel, and he just burst into tears, partially because he was he almost died, and also because he was kind of mad at himself, I think. But for being as scared as he was, is kind of how he says it in interviews. But later on, while he was doing press for the film, a reporter asked how he was treated on set, and his answer that it was like asking a soldier how he was treated in Vietnam. So that's how Ed Harris viewed his time on The Abyss. Although he softened on it later. If you watch him on the making of documentary that came out in 98 or so, he's definitely softened on it, and he looks back not quite fondly, but more fondly than some of the interviews at the time would have made you think.
I went deeper into this to see what Cameron's side of the story would be on this kind of thing with the actors and everything, because at the time I was reading about how the press had all these stories about how mistreated people were, or the American press especially were describing that at any moment they were getting ready to kill James Cameron because of how he was treating them and stuff like that. And anyway, this is a little long, but I'll read it. This is from Cameron during one of the interviews. This is from that book I got on Amazon. But he says, quote, the more we emphasize the secrecy of the film, the more people tended to look for negative information. The first news from the front was Premiere Magazine's article, which set the tone for all future journalism for quite some time. It was a wildly inaccurate piece to the point of being total fabrication in certain specific instances. Yet I would get this article quoted back to me as if it were gospel. I was amazed, and now I'll never believe anything else I read about a film in production unless I know a good source. It reached a point where the actors were interviewed, but their quotes were ignored, and the journalists wrote what they felt like. Very bizarre. None of the actors hated me at all. They were eager to promote the movie, and they'll work with me again if I ask them to. They enjoyed the experience at the time. It was only this revisionist mentality that's been imposed from the outside. What exacerbated the problem, and it took me a while to understand why it was occurring, was the actors always wanted to talk about the most dangerous aspects of the shooting, as those were the areas where they were challenged the most. They wanted credit for going through the great learning adventure. The press always gave it a negative interpretation, as if the actors were complaining. I use this metaphor. If you went on a trip to the Amazon and you saw a poisonous snake, by the time you got back to tell everybody, it's bound to have been changed into, I almost got bitten by a snake and I nearly died. Who wants to hear you were perfectly safe when the entertainment factor is increased by embellishment? Or Cameron says, the shooting of The Abyss was hard work underwater, but never boring. He added, it was different for the actors. For them, it was like being in World War I. They were in the trenches for 3 weeks, so to speak, and they had about 2 hours of dangerous excitement after we got the lighting right. I'd get to the set in the morning, actually the evening, because we were forced to shoot nights for the last half of the entire underwater schedule as our tarp ripped open and let sunlight in, and I had to try to figure out what we could shoot, as there was always a problem with what was scheduled. If we needed to shoot a wide master of the set, there would be bound to be a failure in the pumping. So it goes on to mention a lot of these problems you mentioned already. So we'd have to often just sit and huddle and work out what actors weren't in New York and what we could do instead. Every single day there was a glitch, usually due to a tank system. We planned the shot, readied equipment, worked solidly underwater for 10 hours. The actors were never underwater longer than 2 hours a day. The crew put in all the hours, and we had to decompress at the end of each day. My version of the daily grind was always being busy and driving ourselves beyond fatigue. The actors' version of that reality was they sat around with nothing to do for days on end.
Yeah, a couple of things that in that quote that I think there's you could contradict are that one, it was boring to a lot of the actors. Sometimes he says that it was never boring, but like Michael Biehn looks back at this pretty fondly, as like I said, as does Ed Harris for the most part. He had difficult days, but he does seem to look back at it fondly and says that he had fun doing a lot of like undersea stuff. It was challenging and that was fun to him. But Michael Biehn seems like he was having a good time doing it. But he does say that like there were days when they would, they'd have to sit in a submersible in a sub while they like set up shots and set up lighting, and they'd be in that sub for 8 hours just with nothing to do.
That is what he said. If I read it, he says Cameron said shooting The Abyss was hard work underwater, but never boring. He added, it was different for the actors. For them, it was being in World War I.
Yeah. And the what's her name who plays One Night, she started knitting during the making of this, and she says that like, I'll tell you how long I was in those things, because I knitted 3 entire sweaters during the course of making The Abyss. So,
wow. Well, I totally get that from just the NWA stuff I do. Like the hardest part about TV taping days is like you go in there
waiting around.
Yeah. You're in there from like 10 o'clock in the morning till like 10 o'clock at night. Yeah. And so for the talent, it's just like waiting for your turn to go do something. And so that's the grind.
And the other part of that quote that I would probably contradict is saying that like all the actors loved him and that any of them would work with him again. I don't know that Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio would do that because she did not do press for the film, which he says that all the actors did. She took a conveniently timed like 3-month vacation to Europe during the press tour for The Abyss and kind of ran away. She did, and even on that documentary that came out, I think in 1998, that's on the Abyss DVD, she is nowhere to be seen on the entire documentary. She is not there. She did not participate. So I don't know that she would have worked with him again had she been asked. In fact, one of the most notorious stories from the making of the film involves her. It came about 3 months into the shoot, and it's on a dry set, so it's not in the tank. But it was during the scene where Bud has to revive Lindsay, the most emotional scene in the film by far. So for this scene, Master Antonio had to lie on the floor, soaking wet. Her shirt's ripped open, her boobs are out. Her eye, she can't blink because she's supposed to be dead. She had eye drops in her eyes to dilate her pupils, so she can't see very well because of that. And they're shooting the most emotional, like the emotional climax of the film, basically.
Yeah.
And they shoot it, and the first take is really strong, but the shot wasn't positioned well. The way they were standing, like Harris's arm blocked Master Antonio's face. And then they did a second take, and the second take was incredible. Like, people described it as like magic. Crew members described, the hairs on their neck standing up watching it. It was like exactly what you wanted the scene to be. But it was a little bit longer than the one before it. And just as the scene's about to end, Lindsay's starting to revive. They hear the flapping of film. The camera had run out of film.
God.
And it ruined the scene. And right as they were nearing the finish line, it ruins the scene. It kills all the tension in the room because, again, it's very emotional anyway. And Master Antonio, this is one of the more famous, moments from the making of this that was written about a lot at the time. But she, kind of jumped up and screamed that, we're not animals, and she stormed off the set. And she didn't return for several hours after, apologies from Cameron and Heard. She finally came back, and Ed Harris kind of talking with her helped her come back as well. But while she was gone, Ed Harris filmed his close-ups of the scene, including the line where he says, "You never backed away from anything," and slaps her, and in the cut that we see in the film, he's performing while she's, off in her dressing room or wherever, and he's performing against nobody. He's just performing for the camera, and when he slaps Lindsay, he's just slapping like a sandbag off the screen. But that entire close-up of him is him playing off nobody, which, as good as that scene is, it really makes you appreciate just how fucking good Ed Harris is, that he's playing that off of nobody.
Yeah,
like, that's insane.
God almighty, that's awesome.
Well,
cool.
I mean, it's a little less impressive when you find out Ed Harris is actually a sandbag hobbyist. He collects them. So, like, he's really attached to his collection.
Oh, that
he was using one of his
sandbagger.
personal sandbags.
I mean, when I watched this movie when I was a kid, I was pretty awed by, the underwater stuff, the water tentacle, the aliens, all that showy stuff in the film. That's kind of what most people remember about it. But watching it this time, man, I think this scene is not only the best scene in The Abyss, I think it might be the best scene that Cameron has ever filmed. I mean, it is, from an emotional standpoint, it is incredible. And like I said before, aside from Titanic, Cameron isn't, known for making emotional films, but this is like it's a devastating scene to watch. And it's almost entirely driven by Harris's performance. And for a movie that, has all these stories about the making of it and how difficult it was, the best scene, in my opinion, in the entire movie, there are no special effects at all. There's nothing underwater. It's just a great actor giving an incredible performance, and it makes the scene. It blew me away watching it this time, because when I watched this movie when I was 11, I didn't give a fuck about that. I wanted to see the aliens, and I wanted to see submarines fighting underwater and bumping into each other and all this stuff. But watching it now, I'm like, oh, this guy literally just like watched his wife die in front of him. Like, not just the reviving scene, but the scene before where he, they decide that's what they have to do, and he has to watch her drown, and he screams inside of his helmet, and like, that's emotionally draining, even tough as a viewer.
It's very tough to watch. We've made jokes numerous times about Gary with his feelings on eyeball violence. I had some thoughts and some feelings and about underwater stuff.
Oh, did you almost drown when you were a kid?
I did almost drown. That might be a story for a different time, but needless to say, like, underwater stuff is always a little dicey for me watching.
Wow, this whole movie must have been like triggering.
I had to get up off the couch at least twice,
Really?
and this was one of them. I was like, I have to go into the kitchen and get a snack or something.
I get it.
It was really rough, but just to show that most of the time I can sit through it. This was incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
I wanted to clarify something, by the way, too. That this is it's still about being underwater. The diver that he talked to when he was younger was a volunteer for the experiment of the guy that had done the Duke University thing. So it was a different guy. So I apologize. It was
okay.
He was the diver that the guy from Duke used to test the stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
So he was looking him up and realized his name, and then ended up talking to that guy to get the stuff.
That's actually the next thing I was going to bring up is the scene where the Navy SEAL demonstrates the liquid oxygen on a rat.
Yeah. How did PETA feel about that?
Okay. Well, I don't know how PETA probably didn't like it, but what you're seeing on screen is real. So Cameron, he contacted the researcher, the guy Gary's talking about.
His name was Kylstra. Was the it was like a
I didn't write down his name
or something.
But this was a guy who'd been working on the idea of breathable liquid. He found it. He was at Duke University, which is not too far from Gaffney. It's it's up the road a little bit in North Carolina. Yeah. And the researcher gave Cameron he basically gave Cameron the recipe to create breathable liquid, and Cameron followed his method to a T and recreated the experiment on screen with 5 live rats. So what they would do. So, when they put them under that little basket and the actors are watching them, the reactions you're seeing are real because they're watching the experiment happening in front of their eyes. They didn't want to practice this a bunch of times and put these poor rats through it a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So what they would do is, after each take, Cameron would grab the rat by the tail and spill the liquid from their lungs, just like we see in the movie. And then they would actually take them off to a vet to give them an antibiotic. In case they were to get an infection, because with the liquid coming out of their lungs, it could affect the lining of their lungs, and they could get infected easier. So they'd immediately take them to the vet and give them an antibiotic, and everything went fine for the rats 1 through 4. But when it was the 5th rat's turn, Cameron lifted them up by the tail after the take, and it wasn't squirming. He was just completely still, not breathing. So Cameron's thinking, oh, fuck, everyone's like the whole cast and crew's here. He's like, I cannot have a story coming off of my set where I just drown a rat on camera. So Cameron administered CPR on the rat, not mouth to mouth, just not mouth to mouth, the
compressions.
Compressions, though you call it.
Yeah, it's just compressions.
Yeah, so he was doing that to the rat, and it worked. Wow. And the rat came back, and Cameron actually kept the rat as a pet until it died. It died like a year and a half later, died of old age. But he I guess he felt a connection to the rat after saving its life, and he kept it as a pet. Which I think
one of the people in the interviews asked about it, and he was like, "Yes, that rat was my pet for a year and a half. It died at the equivalent rat age of 95, about a week ago." From when that interview was, he was like, "It's about a week ago, actually." So his life was not shortened in any way.
Yeah.
Apparently the big deal with that stuff that they have a problem with is because of the way it's taken in. Is the FDA never approves it. So they have a hard time with the FDA over here. Yeah. The British censors for this movie actually cut any parts with the rat out. They try to keep the narrative in there, but because of some act that was passed in England that they have to cut it out because it was some law that was helped pass by some veterinarian where you can't show animals.
The royal vet.
Yeah, I guess that was it. But it was the one who takes care of all of the Queen's corgis. Yeah, you can't show an animal experiencing pain or something like that.
But, it's actually, I mean, a lot of people won't probably know this, but Her Majesty actually does drown rats regularly. So they need, after dealing with her subjects, she goes into this special room at Buckingham Palace and just drowns rats.
That's how she deals with stress.
That's also the end of Cinema Shock as we get accused of slander and or libel or whatever.
Cinema Shock is no longer available in the UK. So a lot of the innovations that Cameron and his crew were making to bring the Abyss to life were practical feats of engineering, but there were also major innovations made on the special effects end of things as well. So there's a lot of firsts on this film. The first underwater set of this size, the first time filming with recording sound underwater, the first time drowning rats on screen. But one of the other problems that was left to solve was the water tentacle that the NTIs used to communicate with the crew of the Deep Core. So when he first started reaching out to effects houses about doing this effect, Cameron didn't think that CGI was the answer. He did, in fact, in the letter that he wrote to them, he specifically told them not to use CGI because he didn't think it was there. He didn't think the technology was to the point where they could do that yet. At this point in time, CGI had only been used in a handful of films. I mean, it had been used in Tron and The Last Starfighter, but those take place in computers and inside video games. So having it look kind of blocky and stuff works in those cases. But for the Abyss, Cameron needed the water tentacle to seem organic, which is something that CGI had yet to pull off. One guy who was becoming a proponent for the use of CGI in movies was a special effects maestro by the name of Dennis Muren. I don't know if we've ever talked about Dennis Muren on the show. Have we?
Doesn't ring a bell.
Okay, so I can't get too far into Dennis Muren's background. His background is pretty fascinating, but I'm sure we'll get into that down the line. But this guy is an absolute legend in the world of special effects. Early in his career, he was hired as a cameraman, a special effects cameraman for Industrial Light and Magic. Very, very early on in that company's history. That was the ILM. That's ILM, the special effects company that was founded by George Lucas. Muren was one of the first special effects artists hired for Star Wars. And he helped to build ILM into the company that it would become. Simply put, he is one of the most influential and pioneering visual effects artists of all time. Movies would not look the way that they look now if Dennis Muren wasn't involved.
Wow.
By the late 80s, though, he was looking for a challenge. He had helped usher in a new era of special effects with miniatures and motion control work for Star Wars, but he saw CGI as the future of visual effects, and he was wanting to help move ILM in that direction. In the 80s, George Lucas had actually started his own little computer division. It was called Pixar. It was kind of just a place for George Lucas and the ILM guys to do experiments in CGI and stuff. Well, Pixar got sold to Steve Jobs in 1985 for only $5 million, which is insane because Jobs, when he sold it to Disney 20 years later, sold it for $7.4 billion. So
it did well.
So it was a good investment on
okay.
Steve Jobs'
right.
part. Yeah. But with Pixar no longer part of ILM, that actually gave Dennis Muren the opportunity to push ILM's own CG division without it being a separate thing. And Muren had actually been a big fan of Cameron's Aliens, and he wanted James Cameron to kind of be the first guy that he'd work with. So he approached Cameron about this, and he met with Cameron, and he showed him some rough but promising animation, and he assured James Cameron that ILM could pull off like what he wanted to do with this water tentacle. And Cameron kind of took a leap of faith with ILM, and it did take them about 9 months, which is a long time for the company to complete and deliver just 20 shots of the water tentacle. I think it amounts to, 30 seconds of screen time or something. It's not very much. But when Cameron saw the results, he knew that he had made the right decision. Like as soon as he saw it, he was like, okay, this technology has a lot of potential. And obviously we'll see on our next episode that he uses that technology and pushes it to places that it's never been before on Terminator 2. As written, the ending of The Abyss was to see the NTIs they're sick of seeing humanity hurt each other. They think that we're barreling towards nuclear annihilation, and they use this giant wave that threatens everyone on Earth to teach them a lesson. So pulling off the image of this giant wave, this tidal wave, frozen, looming over cities, was pretty tricky to pull off. And it still wasn't quite finished. They were working on it, but it wasn't quite finished when Fox held its first test screenings of the film in May of 1989. So instead, audiences were shown a drawing of the wave, and special effects not finished or something like that on the screen, which is not uncommon at test screenings. But at this point, though, the film had already been delayed several times due to effects work. I mean, it was already, I think, a month past when it was already supposed to be released, And Cameron also, once again, had a movie that was way too long to be released. It was pushing 3 hours. So he actually opted to cut the wave sequence, even though removing it meant that a lot of the film's major themes were no longer present, which honestly feels a lot like the original cut of Aliens in that regard. But to their credit, this was not a studio mandated cut. The Fox did not come to Cameron and ask him to take the wave stuff out. They did feel that the movie needed to be shorter, and they actually questioned whether removing the wave sequence was the right move, but Cameron actually had final cut in his contract. So it was his decision to make.
Nice.
And so he cut it out. He cut the wave out, and he cut a lot of stuff out of that final conversation between Ed Harris and the NTIs that kind of tie into that. But he got the movie down to, I don't know, I think it was like 2 hours and 17 minutes by the time he cut it all out, instead of 2 hours and like 52 minutes or something like that. It was pretty long to begin with. And when The Abyss was released on August 8th, 1989, it had a new, shorter ending. And unlike Cameron's previous films, reviews were kind of mixed. And a lot of the reviewers specifically targeted the ending of the film. I'll read a couple of excerpts from some of these, and then we'll pass the mic to Gary.
Well, I was going to jump in there too, real quick, just for anybody wondering. I was muted, and so you couldn't hear me. He compared it to, I just thought this was a nice connection. In Aliens, he said there was the part, like when he had to make cuts, because this was not studio mandated. He said he had final cut on the film. And so he just felt like the public wouldn't digest it being that long. And he was never quite pleased with the tidal wave sequence. And he also felt like,
I think the effects were not quite up to what he wanted to do.
Yeah, he said even though they specifically had worked on it for so long, but he said that the idea in Aliens, remember when we talked about a little bit, that there was the thought of like cutting out the stuff on the planet before the Marines get there, because it seems separated from what's going on emotionally with the movie or something. And so he kind of felt that way about the tidal wave sequence at some parts. He felt like there were like positives to it. And because I disagree with him, I actually think it works really well. I like it. I think it's cool, but he says he felt like he shouldn't have anything that he thought there were any negatives to. And one thing there was cutting from this area where like all these people have been together for so long, and there's like this emotional core of things happening, and then you go to the outside world and it's all
a bunch of characters that you've never met before.
Yeah, and you're running from stuff on the surface level, and like you've never seen any of these people in your life. And he said he felt like the reason he cut it was just he felt like it was kind of disconnected from what was happening.
Yeah, and he did, at those test screenings, the wave sequence, even though it was unfinished, this wasn't really why. It being unfinished wasn't really why I think that he got these comments, but they give out the comment cards at these test screenings, and people will put, what scene they like the best and what scene they like the least. And the wave sequence was like evenly split between people. Like some people loved it, some people hated it. And I think the fact that so many people hated it or didn't understand it really is what it was. That's how he interpreted it. They didn't really understand what he was doing with it. That's why he kind of made the decision to cut it out.
Yeah, I actually had not seen that version of the movie before with the wave sequence until this time. And so I thought it was better for me personally. Like I enjoyed seeing, because first of all, I just always love those videos you can find on YouTube or Reddit or anywhere where like the huge fucking waves, like something about like open bodies of water and the weird shit that could happen, but like massive waves are like one of the most wicked nature things that can happen. And just the idea of a tsunami fucking wiping out your town. Just one day you're just like walking down the street and a fucking 50-foot wave just comes.
Right.
Yeah.
You're like,
absolutely
shit.
terrifying.
Yeah. It's wicked. So I don't know, the idea of these waves and I thought it looked good, like just off in the distance, like a giant kaiju or something coming towards the city.
I'll get into it in a minute, but what you're seeing in that cut was not created in 1989. Like
Yeah,
that was finished a few years, well, not many years later, but a few years later.
Gotcha.
So, well, these little blurbs I want to read from some of the publications that were reviewing the film at the time. Remember, these people they're seeing the original theatrical ending without the wave. And Newsweek said, quote, "The payoff to the abyss is pretty damn silly, a portentous deus ex machina that leaves too many questions unanswered and evokes too many other films." The Globe and Mail said, "At its best, The Abyss offers a harrowing, thrilling journey through inky waters and high tension. In the end, however, this torpedo turns out to be a dud. It swerves at the last minute, missing its target and exploding ineffectually in a flash of fantasy and fairy tale shtick." Oof. USA Today said, most of this underwater blockbuster is good, and at least 2 action set pieces are great, but the dopey wrap-up sinks the rest 20,000 leagues. And I think mostly these people are complaining about, they think that the ending is kind of hokey, kind of cheesy, because people were maybe expecting Cameron to give us another Aliens, and the fact that the aliens were benign, I think, threw people off a little bit. That's kind of how I interpreted it, that it was just too nice of an ending, and maybe a little naive of an ending. But that's kind of where I think they're coming from. But Gary, I'm sure you can find some folks on the internet who have their own words to say about. People fucking hate James Cameron on the internet.
They sure do.
I really don't understand it, but
he is not well liked.
I think I would enjoy having a conversation with him. He seems very interesting to me,
and he seems like a very well-intentioned man.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I've got nothing personal against him. And even though to add on to those ones you sent, I saw like a Rolling Stone article that said it out ET's ET. And then there was another blurb from like Film 89 at the time that said just how fucking terrible the script was. Like it was just split down the middle.
So people needed a nap even back then.
Yeah, but
not everyone. Like I said, it was mixed reviews. They had good reviews as well.
Yeah, and but of course, the internet being what it is, there are still plenty of people that in 40 years later who see The Abyss and they still need a nap. Let's start with Willie 9320 here, who says, "What a load of rubbish. I sat through an hour and a half before its soporific effect caused me to switch off and find something interesting to do. Very poor storyline, though the special effects were very good and expensive. But a turnip is still a turnip, no matter how many carrots they give you with it. The pressure effects of working at death were completely ignored, and it was frequently quite hard to know where the actors were actually supposed to be. A far cry from Aliens or Titanic. I'm not surprised this did badly at the box office."
Honestly, it sounds like that guy just wasn't paying enough attention to the movie.
Yeah, yeah, it really does. I don't know how you don't know. Well, the character literally dies from the pressure effects.
Right.
Like him and his ship are.
That's
crushed.
A great death, by the way.
I was going to say the same thing.
That's a great death.
It's actually cool.
It feels like he deserves it. Like it's a very satisfying villain death.
Widsith says, "OMG awful" is the title of this review. I saw the extended version with the real ending. It's just as rubbish as the shorter version. This is an astonishingly poor movie. It's sort of Close Encounters Underwater, but with awful dialogue, one-dimensional characters, and zero imagination. It's the kind of film that one keeps watching, presuming that some development or impressive finale will make up for all the dross that one has to sit through. It doesn't. I watched the longer version, thinking the director's cut might have some qualities that the theatrical release did not. Big mistake. Unless you're a student of bad filmmaking, avoid this one.
Wow.
Yeah. Here's this one's written. This was titled "So Awful I Turned It Off After 20 Minutes." So you already know it's good. You'll know it's even better when you see that the author of this review was named Beat My Meat 11. I was only able to manage watching 20 painful minutes of The Abyss before turning it off. The dialogue by today's standards is horrific. I've watched a number of sci-fi movies from this era, and none of them damaged my soul quite like this one. The introduction of Lindsay Brigman was very cliched. Yes, Cameron, we get it. She's the sassy, intellectually gifted woman and the chief engineer aboard the submarine. with her status, she's in charge of a bunch of male Navy SEALs, and surprise, surprise, they don't respect her. Bremen's leader status is unbelievable, and even her mere presence on a United States submarine is a joke in itself. Although women have been allowed to serve in the Navy for many years now, no woman ever went on a voyage in a U.S. submarine until 26 years after this movie was made. You got that was like
what's his point?
I don't know. Because it almost sounded halfway through, right? Like he was about to take up for James Cameron being sexist. But then at the end, it got kind of like, it's a joke that she's there.
Yeah. What's your point? Also, this movie has aliens living on the bottom of the ocean. Are we looking for realism?
Yeah.
What is your point, dude?
Movie expert 005 says
that's his name.
Yeah.
Movie expert. So he's not a 007, though.
No.
But there are at least 4 others.
Yeah.
This person, their review is titled "Waste of Time" and James Cameron the Thief.
Okay,
So
let's go. I'm out. Okay,
right.
Give it to us.
Most movies from James Cameron are stealing from other movies. Terminator stealing from Westworld. Many action scenes from Terminator 2 are stealing from RoboCop. Abyss is only underwater, but stealing from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. True Lies is stealing from La Totale. Avatar.
It's a remake of La Totale, you dumb shit.
Avatar is stealing from Dances with Wolves or Pocahontas. Titanic is stealing from A Night to Remember. Aliens is stealing from the original Alien. And Alita Battle Angel is stealing from iRobot with Will Smith. I don't like James Cameron. He is the Antichrist. And all of James Cameron movies are very boring. Stupid dialogue and too long.
Titanic is stealing from A Night to Remember, another movie set on the Titanic.
It makes sense. Star Trek 3 is stealing from.
They named the boat the same thing.
Star Trek 2 and 3 are both about some crew on the Enterprise. So
Star Trek 3 is totally ripping off Star Trek 2.
Yeah.
And I say that actually, no, Star Trek 3 is still on there. I was going to say, if I'd used 4, I'd have fucked up because no Enterprise. But anyway, I digress. Kristen says, bad language and abuse of the actress. The movie is riveting to watch in parts, but the bad language is distractingly pervasive, especially the taking of God's name in vain. A huge problem I have with the movie is a scene where Mary Elizabeth
Mastrantonio. It's tough. I know, it's tough.
Is treated very badly.
To be fair, her name does sound like a Harry Potter spell.
That's true.
Or a teacher at Hogwarts.
Yeah.
Being resuscitated with the bare breast exposed. Ed Harris slaps her twice across the face hard and screams, "Fight, you bitch, fight!" It's so unnecessary and awful.
It worked.
Plain and simple. I can't believe anyone would treat the actress or character this way. Completely disrespectful to women.
I mean, he did save her life.
Yeah, he did. That doesn't matter.
He
should have been more respectful about it.
And he slapped a sandbag on the actress.
Yeah.
Bill says, I watched 3/4 waiting for something scary to happen. You know, like in a horror movie. Nada. Turned it off. Don't recommend. Some strange things were happening, but they were not nearly interesting enough to waste more time on this piece of shit.
He's mad that it's not a horror movie.
Yeah, he was mad because
I got really pissed when I watched Dumb and Dumber and Lloyd didn't start.
It wasn't a period drama.
This one's from Straight Shooter, so you know it's legit. It says, one, it's a cross between a disaster movie and an alien contact movie. Neither concept works. 2, to come up with action that occupies half the running time, a character goes crazy, really for no reason. 3, everyone is constantly shouting and screaming. It seems to be the only way the director can convey a sense of crisis. 4, non-stop profanity. I have no problem with swearing when it's needed for character development or as an occasional expletive, but everyone in the Abyss just keeps throwing swear words around with no real purpose except to show they're under stress. These are supposed to be well-educated professionals. And 5, none of the characters are likable. Not one. All of them constantly whine, beg, cry, argue, and lose their temper. One of them keeps calling his ex-wife baby in the most patronizing way. 6, for the denouement, the scriptwriter remembered the second genre that the film was supposed to satisfy and brought the film to a totally hokey climax that was going to make no sense whichever way it was going to end. The back and forth decision explaining was just juvenile.
Why are so many of these people like hung up on the curse words? And this movie doesn't have that much cursing in it anyway. It's PG-13, isn't it?
Yeah,
like,
I think so.
I don't recall there being that much language in it, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'll try to wrap this
PG-13.
up. Here's some quick hits from Letterboxd. James Fitzgerald says, every single plot point took 11 times longer than it should have to resolve. The script went through 0 revisions, and they left as little as possible on the cutting room floor. A masterclass in James Cameron's worst traits. Yep.
Wow.
Talent says, I mean, James Cameron has just never been a good director, has he? The sexism alone makes this movie unbearable. The ignorance of physics, like basic shit, like water pressure. I don't know why these people think they missed water pressure. It is a pretty pivotal thing in the movie.
It's a very pivotal part of the story.
It's just another layer of unbearable. None of the characters are well written or directed. The horror/thrill isn't convincing. And the story is so eye-roll inducing. It's just such a bad movie that it might as well be a comedy.
All of these people also like almost all of these reviews, like people are specifically targeting like James Cameron personally. It seems like not just the movie. It's really it's a very bizarre. I don't understand.
Well, Peaceful Anarchy goes after our cinematographer, Fred. He says a terrible cinematography for which it somehow got nominated. Terrible acting, terrible writing, terrible score, heavy-handed and insulting ending that did not earn the right to use real World War footage. Cameron is clearly enamored with his own creations and self-importance. It's disgusting. David says this movie is a fantastic cinematic tech demo at best, but even that characterization is hamstrung by boring, ugly, ineffective cinematography during all the easy on-set scenes. More importantly, the plot is just unforgivable Reagan-era sexist garbage wrapped up in the abysmal, get it, petulant script written by a sociopathic man who clearly hates women and yet appears to be addicted to marrying and divorcing them. This sucks, and James Cameron should sink down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench with all his Avatar money and just stay there.
I don't understand people say that James Cameron hates women when like most of his movies
have very strong female figures. Yeah.
Some of the strongest characters are women. I mean,
you're right. I didn't even realize how many of these reviews. I only had a couple more here. Blue says, when are we going to collectively as a society come together and say James Cameron movies are dog shit?
Wow. You think that's what we should come together as a society on?
Yeah. Right now in this day and age, we should really get together at least we can agree on that. Both sides of the aisle. And finally, Kevin says, are you kidding me? Cameron really went up to his producers and was like, it's the Poseidon Adventure meets The Perfect Storm, meets Das Boot, meets AI, meets Interstellar, plus the ending of Orday.
Most of those movies were not out yet.
I was going to say at least 3 of them weren't out yet.
But hey, let's throw in some nuclear warheads, a hurricane, and some aquatic Donnie Darko looking aliens. And they gave him $70 million. All caps. Jimmy couldn't choose a single storyline or genre to stick to. The Disney score is terrible. The handheld camera work is distracting. The characters are stock at best. And the geography of their underwater rig makes no sense. The whole second half is a giant fucking mess. Lol. This movie is atrociously bad. The only good part was Michael B., who is psychotic but very hot.
I mean, we can all agree on that.
Thanks, Kevin.
Cinema Shock stands with you. Michael B. is hot.
We can all get behind that aspect. That's that. Michael Bean's the part that brings both sides of the aisle.
And you heard it here. Gary said he'd get behind Michael Bean.
I heard 100%. Yeah.
Was that all of them, Gary?
Yeah,
that's all.
I would like to take all of those people and put them in a little gate and submerge them in pink liquid,
but not the breathable kind.
No, just pink liquid.
Well, for the first time in his career, the film also underwhelmed at the box office, bringing in $90 million worldwide on a $45 million budget. That guy said 70. I think maybe with marketing it might have been closer to 70, but 45 is the number that I found. But $90 million on 45, so it's not a flop, but it definitely was underwhelming compared to what they were hoping for. It did, however, get nominated for 4 Academy Awards and brought home the Oscar for Best Special Effects. Very well deserved, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then in 1992, Cameron was given the chance to re-edit the film. This is after the success of Terminator 2, of course. He was able to re-edit the film for a special edition, adding 27 minutes of material, including the newly finished wave sequence that we talked about. So that's the version that you watched, right, Gary? Was that the version you watched, Todd?
Yeah.
You watched the
special edition
version? I think I texted you guys and I was like, hey, if you only have time to watch one, watch the special edition. I watched both. And I think I texted you guys after watching the longer cut, and I do think it's the definitive version of the movie because it really does hammer home the themes of the film, which I think were lost on the theatrical cut, much like in Aliens. We talked about the themes of motherhood and stuff in that, which kind of get lost if you don't know that Sigourney Weaver's character is a mother, which they cut out of the theatrical version.
Well, and it gives some stakes to the alien too. Like I felt like that's kind of missing in the other version that I remember. That it was just kind of like they're a lot of talk, but can they back it up? And then, I don't know, for something about seeing the waves, I was like, oh shit, like they could just fucking wipe up the planet right now. They could just get us out.
Yeah, if they choose to. And you guys both kind of grew up watching this, but Gary, you had never seen the special edition before this.
I don't think I had, because when the wave stuff started happening, I was like, shit, I don't remember this. This is going to be the new part. Like, I don't remember.
What about you, Todd? Had you ever seen the special edition?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think the one
because you grew up watching it like on TV,
exactly,
which would have been the theatrical cut.
Yeah. So this was probably the theatrical on television, so modified. So this was the first time getting to see. I think this was my first time getting to see any version of it from beginning to end.
Oh, without commercial breaks?
Yeah, without commercial breaks. Yeah.
Really? That's fun. That's interesting.
What credit did I have to give to one of the reviewers? Well, no, I'm not giving them any of those people credit, but I will say this. Thinking of it as a horror movie, there was definitely, this movie had the lines were blurred when it was released, or the way that it was pitched or something. They tried to make it,
marketing maybe thought that he was doing another Aliens.
Yeah. Well, so if you're looking at James,
or they wanted to sell
Aliens and the Terminator, so he's clearly got like this evil bend to them, or like some kind of force like coming at them. So the fact that the aliens they're just like friendly and just like,
I mean, the monster here is Coffee,
the people,
Lieutenant Coffee,
right. Or the idea of the Cold War or whatever,
just humanity in general.
And I was looking that up too, and so Cameron, it says that he was worried about all that he called them, quote, dive-in movies. Maybe it was a misprint, maybe a drive-in, I don't know. But he said, my cause for conserved
it's a pun.
Okay. Oh yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry that I missed that, Jim.
Not known for his comedy, that Jim Cameron.
He says, my cause for concern vanished when I found out what they were about. I had to give the audience enough credit to be able to distinguish between my other films and the other relatively straightforward horror shockers. My concern was whether it was being sold ambiguously as containing horror elements. I'm still worried about these wrong impressions hits this publicity tour where I can redress and emphasize the differences. So this is from his press tour. He said his fears were compounded when he got to England, because he said, I got here and he was like, I was asked by the girl at passport control why I was here. I said to promote my movie. She asked me what it was, and I told her, and she replied, "Oh, it looks absolutely horrifying." She was responding to these studio approved trailers and the television presentation. And so what The Abyss is really about is a message that doesn't seem to be coming through loud and clear for a reason I don't understand. I suppose everyone naturally assumes it's in the same mode as my last two movies.
Well, I think that was part of the problem was the marketing of it, but also when it came out in 1989, the film's message got lost. A big part of that was because of the excise footage, that we've talked about, but also because all of these stories, like the one James Cameron mentioned in Premiere Magazine, all these stories that surrounded the making of the film almost overshadowed it. There's talk of cost overruns, directorial hubris. These are all things that we'll continue to hear about on James Cameron movies, especially on Titanic and Avatar. And they kind of threaten to overwhelm the conversation on the actual film. The film is, whether you agree with the story points or whatever, it is a marvel of filmmaking technique. I don't know how anyone could argue that.
No, that much is clear.
And Cameron, he does have a bad reputation as being kind of a tyrant on sets, but we have all these stories about the making of the film and his behavior, but none of them sound as bad as like you kind of think that they're going to. Like he was tough and he did yell at people, and he's even admitted in later years that I thought that's how you should, that I thought that's how you led a set, and I was wrong. And he said that, but you also have to remember that he's not just a guy standing on the sidelines. Like, he is living and breathing this film from concept to release. And he never asked his cast or crew to do something that he was unwilling to do himself. This was physically demanding on everyone involved. But, if the actors are spending 4 hours on underwater, which would have been a long day. Normally it was like a couple of hours, but if they spend 4 or 5 hours, he's down there for 12 hours. He's a leader, and he's leading by example, and some of his leading techniques might be frowned upon, but nobody could ever accuse him of not being in the trenches with his soldiers, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like, he is down there leading, and he is the first one to get in. And the Michael Biehn even tell a story. He's like, hey, I've been there all day, and I get out and I get dressed and I'm leaving, and Jim's still underwater. He's hanging there decompressing and watching dailies and talking on the phone to the studio, and he's still working, and he's on set for 18 hours a day.
Jeez.
It's wild. But I mean, so we can't, we weren't there on set, so we don't know. But I don't think he was ever abusive to anyone. From the stories don't make it sound like he was. It sounds like he was just very demanding of his employees. So we obviously wouldn't condone any kind of actual abuse, but it doesn't sound to me like he was. I mean, and I'm not saying James Cameron's a saint. James Cameron has some, he's had some difficulties in his life with being a dick, and he's gone through 5 wives for a reason.
Yeah, I think there's a confidence at play and a very like focused attitude. I mean, you meet some people like I'm not trying to name drop, but just to throw it out there, there are some people that are on a different level. Like, when you talk to a guy like in my other job, I deal with Mr. Corgan, Billy Corgan, and he has a reputation sometimes for being a dick. I have found that guy to be nothing but like the coolest fucking guy in the world to be around. Nice. There is a way that he talks sometimes that just, he's very sure of himself, and he knows what he wants. Well, and he does not want to go a different direction. And he'll ask you for your opinion if he wants it. And that otherwise, don't bother, because he'll just tell you to stop. And
I mean, and that's the job of someone who's leading, like, an organization like Billy Corgan is, or who is directing a multi-million-dollar movie. Like, I mean, some directors are and filmmaking is a collaborative process from beginning to end anyway, but the director is the guy who like is steering the ship, and he has to be very confident in which direction that ship is going, and James Cameron is very confident in his abilities, and he's proven, I think, that he deserves to be. I mean, he is the smartest guy in the room. He is always the smartest guy in the room, it seems like. I'd like to get him and Cronenberg in a room together and see what they.
It would be interesting. But I said that because I even have another. I keep reading these quotes, but again, like you said, there's so much out there with him, and he talks a lot about this stuff, so it's fun to read. But in a totally separate interview, talking about like how people misinterpret the movie or expect something and don't get it or whatever. Another interviewer had asked him that, and he said, quote, it sounds like a totally different tone than the last part. He says, is it my fault that audiences don't grasp the fact that these creatures have to be protected from our violently human negative influences? Coffee, Michael Biehn, is the monster of the piece, but people still manage to get the last 15 minutes and be amazed it has an uplifting ending. I find this incredible because all manifestations of the aliens are benign. When the mothership comes up from behind the cliff and Mary Elizabeth Master Antonio touches it, the music, her expression, the production design, we're saying something that should be very clear. When the NTIs send the pseudopod water tentacle as a probe to the rig, it communicates with the crew. It's quite equivocal. It's meant to be wondrous because the crew's reaction is to laugh and smile. The thing is attempting positive communication. How do audiences keep propelling themselves beyond that to a point where they think the creatures are threatening? The movie defines itself well before this. The sense of disappointment some people have when the aliens turn out to be nice, I think, says a lot about the audiences for movies. The signals sent out from the beginning are the ones of benevolence. I can understand the misinterpretation of maybe the initial contact with the USS Montana submarine, as it isn't clear it hits the turbulent wake of the mothership. But I'm at a loss trying to understand why other people don't understand this.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. I mean, their first contact with the water tentacle is completely benign. Like, why would they, they're clearly just trying to communicate. And I don't understand why people think that later on in the movie, all of a sudden they're going to be evil or something, it really is. He put that very well, I think.
He puts it well, but it's not like mean or anything, but it is with a very much, it felt like to me very much a tone of like,
what the fuck,
I did my part.
Yeah,
like, I don't know why you can't get it.
Yeah. And despite the fact that this was not as successful as most of Cameron's other films, although, like I said, it wasn't a flop, the movie still pushed the art of blockbuster filmmaking forward in ways that many films do not. I mean, we mentioned all of the literal filmmaking techniques and equipment that were invented just for this movie, and the almost like incredible leap forward that CGI took with this movie, just with that one scene. And looking at it now, that scene is a little dated, but it still looks pretty good for a movie that is, what are we at, 35 years old at this point, almost 33 years old. So yeah, it still looks pretty good, and of course it led to further advances in CGI. I mean, he really pushes the boundaries of it in Terminator 2. But, even though we've talked a lot about, in the last couple of hours about the kind of harrowing filming of The Abyss, all the stories, because it's one of the most infamously difficult movie shoots of all time. It's up there with Jaws and like Apocalypse Now. It's like when people talk about difficult movie shoots, they talk about Apocalypse Now, Jaws, and The Abyss, because on all of those people almost die. But because it is an insane story, so that's why we told the story here, because it is a very interesting, crazy story to tell. But I think that because there were so many of those stories coming out at the time of its release, that the final product didn't get the attention that it deserved as just a film. And part of that's from expectations, like Gary was saying. But this is sort of, some of the reviewers said this is a negative thing, but this is sort of Cameron's answer to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's a big-hearted sci-fi movie about the first contact between humanity and an alien species who, at first, their motivations are unclear, but they end up being fairly benign. And I am also, like, I mentioned this on Aliens too, but I'm torn on which cut of the film is better. I do think the shorter version is more focused, and I think it's paced better, but the thematic heart of the film is weakened in that original cut. I even found a quote from Cameron himself where he says, "I like the wave version. I like the idea that we are judged and found wanting by rational godlike aliens, but then saved by one good man. As a mob, we're a lost cause. As individuals, there is hope." Which, that's a great quote, and he's right. And the ending's a little cheesy of both versions, honestly, but especially the wave version. It's a little cheesy, but I do think it's the better version of the film overall, even though I don't think it's paced as well as the theatrical cut. I think I prefer the wave version too.
I'm in that camp as well.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, since this was your first time seeing it as well, which one you preferred. So you also prefer the wave version?
Yeah, I do. I think it, because they do mention it in dialogue. It's a theory. They don't know it for a fact, but they mention that, they can control water. And the tentacle is clear evidence of that.
Right.
But I don't think, all these people who are saying, you know, that they don't get Cameron's films, like he makes it pretty clear. Like, there's been things that I have not understood in watching a particular film. I won't get into examples because I'll just catch a bunch of shit for it. But
do we need to explain the Matrix to you again?
But there's but his it's pretty clear, and it's very clear in the special edition. And
he is not subtle about what he's trying to say at all.
And again, it's not this huge heady concept. It's like, hey, we're this outside party. You guys should be nicer to each other.
Right.
Like,
if I had any criticism of that, I almost had like an eye roll moment a little bit when it kept showing the war scenes, like they're flashing it up on their TV. And I was just kind of like, okay, like, we get it. Like,
we get it. Like I said,
blow each other up.
Nobody could ever accuse James Cameron of being a subtle filmmaker in any way, shape, or form.
I thought it was funny in that quote you just gave too. It's just like he talks about the individual a little bit there, because in another one I had just on the side, he said, I wanted to make The Abyss because I was interested in a cold, dark, threatening, and very sterile environment. How, as human beings, we are pushing our mental and physical limitations to adapt to that environment. We are using technology to push ourselves further into ever more hostile environments, including outer space. But the more we rely on technology, the more we have to rely on each other and our basic capacities as humans to bond emotionally, in friendship, or in love. These factors keep us from destroying each other and allow us to survive in situations we wouldn't have a hope in otherwise.
Yeah.
I liked that too, which is talking about he was interested in the, just the idea. He was also interested in humans coming together. Like how,
I mean, the Abyss is above all, it is a love story. I mean, it really is. I mean, especially between Bud and Lindsay. I mentioned the resuscitation scene earlier. That entire like 10 minutes surrounding that scene that I talked about earlier, where she drowns, and then she basically has to sacrifice herself, and then he has to bring her back. But there's also, the scene later on that kind of mirrors that thematically, where Bud makes the decision to essentially sacrifice himself when he has to go disarm the nuke, and he has to descend into the abyss. And at this point, he's unable to speak. Because she was dead technically, so she was not able to speak, and it's his voice bringing her back basically. And in the scene where he's going down the abyss, she's having to talk to him, and it's kind of almost a one-way conversation, other than him being able to type a little bit. But she's having to kind of keep him lucid enough to disarm the nuke. But then he runs out of oxygen, and it's his turn to die. I think that she even says after she comes back, she's like, next time it's your turn or something like that. But that time it is his turn. Like he decides, there's no way I'm getting back up. I've done my duty, and it's time to die. And he kind of accepts it, and they say their goodbyes. But then he is sort of reborn like she was when the NTIs come and rescue him. They bring, you see the little creepy hand come out and grab him, and they bring him into their vessel, which is a scene that I love. Also, the way the water kind of separates, I think, really rad. I've always
it's pretty cool.
It looks really cool. But he he's watching the NTIs as they show him, and this is in the the special edition version, I guess. But he's watching as they show him all the bad shit that humanity has done. They show him the wave. They show him the news footage of the wave. It seems to be happening in real time. And the wave is sort of paused, ready to wipe out humanity for their sins. But then the wave recedes and goes back. And when he asks, he says, you could have done it. Like, why didn't you do it? And their answer comes back up on the screen. They show him the text message that he sent to Lindsay, which was, love you, wife. That was his goodbye to her. Because to me, what the end of this film is, and it comes across a little cheesy, but to me, it's like you've got the NTIs. They've been down there long enough to know that humanity kind of sucks. Like, they've seen that we're capable of hurting each other. They've seen that we're capable of killing each other. They've seen all the terrible things that humans are capable of. And in the movie, that's shown in the form of, nuclear holocaust and the Vietnam War and all these things. But if it were made today, it would probably show like news footage about school shootings, As I was writing my notes for this episode, like literally as I was writing my notes, the news about the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade came through. And in the last couple of days since that, I mean, we've seen riots, we've seen police brutality, we've seen some pretty horrible stuff in our real world the last couple of days. And I mean, this world undoubtedly is a terrible place, filled with terrible people. But the NTIs in the Abyss spared us because they saw the potential of the human race to do better and to be better. And I think that's a pretty uplifting way to, I think that's a pretty great uplifting ending. There's nothing wrong with an uplifting ending because they see that, yeah, we have the potential to be cruel and to hurt each other and to kill each other, but they also see the potential of humanity to love each other. And it's that love that makes the NTIs believe that humanity was worth saving in the end.
I think he literally at one point says they just need us to grow up a little bit or something like that. So it's just like an interesting way of they're obviously it seems like they're a race that's been around for a very, very long time. And they're like, okay, you're still stuck in caveman days.
Right.
And it's time to evolve a little bit.
And it's really this one man's sacrifice, and he's sacrificing. Yeah. They see that he loves his wife, but he's also willing to sacrifice his life for all of his friends. And they see that, hey, if this guy can do it, anybody can do it. And they spared the entire human race because they saw the potential in humanity to not be cruel and horrible, And I love that ending. I honestly do. And a lot of people do think it's hokey, but I don't think, I've said this before on the show. I said it a lot during our Wachowski series, but I don't mind a hokey ending if it emotionally resonates. And I think
it made me think of, honestly, it was the fact that, well, I mean, we're going to go into another one where it's all about you're in control of your fate, basically. So it's, it's the whole world could end or you can make it better or whatever. So maybe this is just a James Cameron just trying to bring some hope into the universe. You can't hate on that. Just like I had to learn to not hate the Wachowskis for Speed Racer.
Hey, you ended up liking Speed Racer, if I remember correctly.
That's what I'm saying. I was just finally you know what? I can't hate on something just being so earnest and just nice.
Exactly.
You got to have that in the world. It can't all be blowing people up. And so that's good. And
not all the aliens have to be mean. You know?
Yeah, exactly. It's I can see the weirdness if you come off Aliens and Terminator and you get to this one, you're like, oh, now there are friends. Okay, thanks, James.
Yeah. Hey, James, I mean, Steven Spielberg did it. He did Close Encounters and E.T., and then he did War of the Worlds. So, where they're not exactly good guys. I mean, granted, that was 2 decades later, but still.
Yeah, I do like, the movie didn't do as well, and maybe it was because of some of that confusion, but he doesn't seem fazed. Even in some of these interviews I read, he talks about he's like, I work with high budgets, so I have a responsibility to my financiers. But he basically says in one interview, he's like, what my job is to stick to the script that they thought was commercial enough to back it in the first place. We already sold it. He said, so once that decision's made, they gave me the money. I don't second guess anything. He's like, I shoot what I think works, and I don't worry about how commercial it's going to be anymore.
Yeah. And, I mean, that he's right though. I mean, that's a really good perspective, I think.
Yeah. Because he's like, I got enough. I think he literally said, I've got enough problems that'll come up on set without having to worry about whether the world's going to be ready for this movie in a year.
Yeah.
So
I like that.
It's I mean, he's very confident about that thing. And he was like, I found one after Terminator 2 where he's talking about, they asked him about the Abyss again. He said, you know what I found out after making 4 movies is how hard it is to please anybody. And one should not even aspire to that anymore. If you make a movie along given guidelines, you get condemned for not being original. If you attempt to throw off conventions and formulas, people say it doesn't fit the party line. He said, reviews for the Abyss were evenly divided between positive and negative. I prefer that to them all being mediocre. There were enough people that got the gag. I find that satisfying. Nice. He goes on to say, it was successful, or it was financial, or it made money in America. He was like, it wasn't Batman. He's like, we did okay.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be fair to compare any other 1989 film to Batman.
Also, just you guys might get a kick out of this. I thought this was funny. In one of the interviews from back then, They asked about his next movie after The Abyss. Apparently, there were huge rumors going around that James Cameron would go on after this movie to make Blade Runner 2. And so they asked him straight up about that. Like, are you going to make Blade Runner 2? And this is his quote, which I thought was fun for a few different reasons. He says, I have nothing to do with Blade Runner 2. I wouldn't be interested, and I don't want to go around cleaning up after Ridley Scott for the rest of my life. Nor will I sequelize any of my own films. My only plan for the future is to not have too many technical considerations next time. I don't want hardware to break my focus on the actors, which was a great danger on The Abyss. The only concrete plan I have is to executive produce my wife's new film, Johnny Utah. And I'm only doing that so I can watch her do all the work and lie back, body checking anybody who interferes.
What was Point Break originally just called Johnny
I was about
Utah?
to say, and that movie has got to be because Catherine Bigelow, who he had married at this point, directs Point Break. And Keanu Reeves plays Johnny Utah. So I think he's talking about Point Break. He wants to just be there hanging out on the set of Point Break.
Well, that's not what happened.
And I love that he's not going to clean up after Ridley Scott for the rest of his life, and that he will, nor will I sequelize my own films.
You're going to eat those words there, James. And now he's literally making 5 Avatar movies now as well. So real quick before we wrap things up, guys, further viewing for The Abyss. What you guys got?
I think
what would you pair with The Abyss? Like, I mean, we've talked about Armageddon a few times.
Yeah,
we've said Armageddon. I think one of the reviews mentioned like Interstellar, which I think would work. 2001 would be a fun
2001
one.
Seems like the most obvious one.
Yeah.
I
actually, by the way, sorry, Todd, I was going to say, you're going to hate this, but another one it made me think of, and I couldn't help it, was Prometheus. And I felt like Prometheus fit. And I especially thought of you.
You're going to have to explain yourself.
Well, no, just because it's like these I don't know, just they find the alien life and they're like investigating it. I don't know, just this there was something about it that felt the same. I think what made me especially think of it though was the first time they send that little probe thing up, and Masteriano, or whatever her name is,
Master Antonio,
just
call her Lindsay
Antonio. The first thing she fucking does is she reaches out and touches the fucking thing and like rubs it. And I watched that and I said, Justin should be tearing that apart as much as he tore apart the Prometheus for the side just touching a fucking alien when they first saw it.
I don't know. They at least she had gloves on. Anyway, what do you got, Todd? Something better than Prometheus, I hope.
I don't know. That remains to be seen. No, I was actually going to go with 1997 Contact, directed by Robert Zemeckis. It kind of has that. It's a blue collar. I feel like it's a blue collar approach to this very interesting concept. It's a little more heady, I think.
A little.
Yeah, it's a little more heady than The Abyss, but I mean the dynamic between McConaughey and Jodie Foster, McConaughey and anybody really, but I just think it kind of hits a lot of the same notes, and you know, pretty much everything minus the water. But yeah, that would be my twofer.
Yeah, Contact was actually on my list as well.
Oh, cool.
That was one that I thought of because I agree. I think it's pretty similar, only the difference being that Jodie Foster's character is actively looking for aliens for years instead of just coming across them. But it does have that sort of same awe-inspired, you know, contact with them. It's a really good movie. It's a lot slower and it's a lot more, like you said, a lot more heady. I mean, it's based on a book by Carl Sagan, so you know, so it's pretty heavy on the science part of it. But so that's one I thought of. And the other one I actually mentioned it earlier in the episode is it's not a particularly great movie, but I think Sphere is pretty similar. I mean, Sphere is not a bad movie. Nice. I don't think I've seen it since it came out in theaters. Based on a Michael Crichton novel, and I remember when it came out being very excited because I was a big Michael Crichton fan when I was a kid, and then it didn't quite live up to that, but it's another great underwater adventure. And have you guys ever seen Sphere?
I don't
years.
remember anything.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, so it's pretty similar in concept as this, where you've got a group of scientists living underwater or doing their research underwater, and then they come into contact with an alien force, sort of. Nice. It's worth checking out, I think, if you've never seen it. So that would be my pick, and the other ones that I had listed were Contact and 2001: A Space Odyssey. So we're kind of all on the same page here. But next week we're moving on, or next episode, I should say, we're moving on to watch James Cameron eat those words that he spoke in those interviews, because somehow, some way between the couple of years after The Abyss, he was convinced to do Terminator 2, probably with a large sack with a big money sign on it, if I were to guess. Yeah. And once again, he's going to innovate, and he's going to make more money than anyone could imagine. So
for anybody wondering, yes, my testicles do have a tattoo of a dollar sign on them.
So that's where we're at for our next episode. We're talking about Terminator 2. What's that, 1991, 1992, something like that? I can't.
It was 92.
I think it was 92. My first exposure to James Cameron, my first exposure to the Terminator. So I'm very, very excited. Not my first exposure to Schwarzenegger, though. I don't know what that was. Maybe Kindergarten Cop. Was that before Terminator? I don't remember.
IMDb list Terminator 2 is 91, just to be
91.
Oh,
it is
okay.
91. Okay. All right. Yeah. So another great movie, another one with multiple endings.
If that stopped anybody from finding it, because you're like,
thanks.
Oh, fuck, where? Oh, I've looked all over all movies from 1992.
Yeah. Or they just looked at Shocking Dark, which was one of my further viewings for the first Terminator, which is also called Terminator 2, which is, you guys still got to watch it. It's amazing. But that's all I got for this week, guys. We're going to move on to our the next part of James Cameron's story on what is sure to be another epic episode, because all of these seem to be, because the stories behind his films are just fascinating. Honestly, they really are. And like I said, they're very well documented. So we've got a lot of resources on these. So thank you guys for sticking through these longer episodes. We hope that you're digging them.
Yeah. James Cameron goes all in on everything he does. So
he sure does.
Definitely lends to some stories and a lot of discussion.
His underwater documentaries as a side project right now. And yeah, the guy is dedicated to everything he does. Like, he is all in. He doesn't half-ass anything. Whole asses everything.
It's weird, but all right.
Anyway, where can you guys be found on the internet for our listeners?
I'm at This Is Gary Horn on all the social medias.
And if you enjoyed my Star Trek silliness and want to hear more, head over to my show, The Computer Resumed Podcast, where we're covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order with a rotating panel of fascinating friends and interesting individuals. Available now wherever you get your podcasts, on all the socials at Computer Resume. And you can find me at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and D&D Beyond.
I am at Justin_Bishop. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, all that stuff. I am working on a list on Letterboxd, by the way, of all of our further viewing picks.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, one of our listeners, Kurt Manchester, loyal listener for a long time. He heard me say on one of the Cronenberg episodes, I mentioned that, man, I wish we'd have just kept a list on Letterboxd of all these, and he took it upon himself to make that happen. So
thanks, Kurt.
Yeah. So now he made a little Google Doc and sent it to me. So now I'm working on turning that into a Letterboxd list, because I was not willing to go back and listen to all of our old episodes, but he was. So
well, thanks, Kurt. That's awesome.
Thanks, Kurt. It's pretty cool.
That's
so we'll
awesome.
Hopefully by the time this episode's out, I'll have that finished, and it'll be up there on my Letterboxd as well. You can find the show at cinemashock.net. The newly redesigned cinemashock.net. Find all of our episodes and all links to our merchandise over on Threadless, links to our Discord server where you can come chat with us. Mostly me, because Todd doesn't do anything in there, and Gary pops in with a meme every now and then, and that's mostly it.
That's true.
but
or replies to a conversation 2 days too late.
Right. Yeah. But they're always entertaining memes. But we've got a lot of other like friends of the show and listeners and stuff who pop in there. So it's a lot of fun. We're also at cinema_shock on Twitter and Instagram, and find us on Facebook and YouTube, where I think all of our episodes are up now. Is that right, Gary?
They are all
right?
there, and all the trailers.
Yeah, except for Shogun Assassin, apparently.
Yeah, Shogun Assassin. It
YouTube
docked me
won't let us.
every fucking time I tried to upload that trailer.
Yeah,
it said no.
But yeah, a lot of fun stuff. Like, did you get Xenogenesis up there? James Cameron Xenogenesis?
Oh no, I need to do that. I do that. I have Curse of the Fly.
Nice.
I haven't posted it yet, but it's waiting. It's in the drafts.
Yeah, we got a lot of fun supplemental material on there.
I'm just gonna start doing cinematic things related to stuff we talk about, or just weird cinematic things. I think I say we just go for it.
Yeah, why not?
Subscribe to the YouTube. It's going to be fun. It'll be a fun one to subscribe to.
It's going to be fun. We get enough subscribers, maybe we'll start doing some live streams over there or something every now and then. That'll be fun. Gary's got a lot of experience with that with the NWA, so in fact, I think we need to sign off because Gary's got one in about 10 minutes.
It is true.
So until next time,
may the wings of liberty never lose a feather,
and be excellent to each other. Just like the aliens said in this movie, just be excellent to each other.
Correct.
Yeah?
That's a good point.
I know how alone you feel. Alone in all that cold blackness. But I'm there in the dark with you. Bud, you're not alone. Oh, God. Remember that time? You were pretty drunk. You probably don't remember. But the power went out in that little apartment we had on Johnny Street. We were staring at that one little key, and I said something really dumb, like that key was me, and like every one of us is out there alone in the dark in this life, and you took out another key and you put it beside mine and said, no, see, that's me. We stared at the two keys, and then, well, if you remember any of this, I'm sure you remember the next part, but there are two keys in the dark. I'm with you. I'll always be with you, bud. I promise that. Scene. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate that. That was
slow clap.
Best one yet. Best one yet.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's the performance that sold it, honestly.
It was.